Chapter 1329. But the company's supervisors are also saying that the company is being targeted. It's a difficult thing to be targeted when you're on the rise. Everyone says that we can't hold on any longer. The employees on the rooftop tightly gripped the railings at the edge of the rooftop. Hearing this, Feng Ling coldly looked at the life-saving railing in his hand. I'm the CEO of the company. If I say I won't lay off the employees, I won't lay off the employees. Do the rumors they spread count, or do my words count? Feng Ling's voice was strong and clear. The employee on the rooftop knew that the camera was aimed at her. Her words were not only for him, but also for the thousands of employees of the company to see, so of course they counted. The restless employees in the other offices finally calmed down and believed that it was indeed just a rumor. You also know that the company is now being targeted. So this so-called targeting, in addition to blocking the various projects, is it possible that there is a psychological attack? Feng Ling said indifferently, although the rumors are small, they are fearsome. When all the employees of a company are in a state of panic and can't even carry out their normal work, how can they have the capital to turn the tables? I'm afraid they won't even be able to maintain the most basic business. The other party is the one who will really collapse. Will really lose completely. Feng Ling said coldly, now, I promise in front of all the employees of the company that I won't lay off anyone. In the future, if you hear any trouble, just call my private number to report it. If there are any problems, I'll use this method to explain to everyone. Rumors can not only destroy a person, but also a company. Most of you are old employees of the Feng Corporation. I believe that you pay more attention to your relationship with the company than a newcomer like me. Don't let these rumors destroy everyone's mentality at work. Now, maintain your original state and wait for me to return. In the end, Feng Ling's tone gradually softened, and her words were no longer as sharp. However, the old employees were filled with emotions. That's right. They had been in the Feng Corporation for many years, and their feelings for this place were too deep. At this moment, the staff on the rooftop nodded submissively and could only wipe their tears with emotion. They were no longer in the mood to seek death. It's just a small rumor crisis, but it has alarmed all the major media in New York. It's really my fault for causing everyone to panic like this. The responsibility is also mine. It's my responsibility. I solemnly declare that as long as I'm here, the Feng Corporation will not collapse, and I won't let you lose your jobs. In just a few words, Feng Ling had already instilled in everyone the idea that as long as she was there, they would definitely be able to keep their jobs. After she took over the company, although most of the employees accepted this new president, many of the old people actually didn't take this young man seriously. And in this small crisis, the collapse of the employees' confidence was quietly resolved, and at the same time, Feng Ling's image as the new CEO became stronger in front of all the new and old employees. In the Feng Corporation's office building in New York, the employees in the office gradually returned to their posts to continue working, and the media gradually retreated. As they did not capture any surprising news, a big matter that had been stirred up became a small dispute in a company, so no media was willing to spread it around. An hour later, Feng Ling heard Qin Shuk's report and finally heaved a sigh of relief in her heart when she heard that the matter had calmed down. Although it's only a small dispute, stabilizing the employees' moods and calming things down is more important than explaining to the media. Feng Ling has clearly found the main point. Xiao Su commented, I didn't expect Feng Ling to have changed so much after leaving the base for just 2 to 3 years. Her heart is stronger than before, and she has indeed become more stable. If Feng Ling was only an outstanding member of 11 base back then, it can be said that her wings have hardened a lot, and she has indeed grown up. Xiao Su looked at Li Nanheng. Li Nanheng's ink-black eyes were fixed on Feng Ling's face on the screen. He did not shift his gaze away from her for even a minute. She's still immature, but at least she's more stable and calm than I imagined. After a long while, when everything on the screen ended, Li Nanheng's thin lips moved slightly. It's already very good. It's only been 2 to 3 years. You can't expect her to reach the level of a first-class enterprise management in 2 to 3 years, but it's already very good that she used the most appropriate method to resolve the crisis. Li Nanheng played with the remote control in his hand. Isn't the most appropriate way to run over to me and ask me to help her? Hug my leg and shout for hubby to help me? Xiao Su, Feng Ling had been busy in the company for 2 days and had barely left the company. She lived in the company because she did not want to contact CEO E anymore. However, right now, the phone corporation was on the rise. No matter what, she had to obtain other resources. Otherwise, not only would she have come to Washington for nothing, but she would also have lost a lot. Have you really never considered asking Li Nanheng to help you? Right now, the phone corporation needs to rope in people everywhere, but isn't the most direct way to rope in the Li Corporation? Li Nanheng is really crucial to this matter. Don't give him a cold war anymore. Soften up a little and express your stance to him. The phone corporation won't be so bumpy. Qin Shuk knew that Feng Ling didn't like to hear this, but she had no choice but to suggest softly. Seeing that Feng Ling didn't speak, Qin Shuk sighed again. In the past, I wasn't very familiar with Li Nanheng. In my impression, I often heard cousin Mingzhu talk about him, but the Li Nanheng I heard is a very cold, difficult to approach, and bad-tempered man. However, from you, I feel that he's a man who loves you very much. No matter what, instead of pleasing so many people like CEO E, you might as well smile at Li Nanheng. This is more useful than anything else. Feng Ling pursed her lips and glanced at her. Qin Shuk decided not to speak, but when she turned to walk out of the office, she muttered softly, "You're so patient with CEO E and the other bosses. You often smile at others, but you might not be able to achieve your goal. Those cooperation cases might not fall into your hands, but if you treat Li Nanheng like this, I'm afraid he can send the whole world to you." The office door opened and closed. The room was silent. Feng Ling lowered her head and continued to work. Suddenly, her phone vibrated. Chapter 1330. The person who called was Mr. Mike's assistant. He asked Feng Ling if she had time to go to Mr. Mike's resort this weekend. This was something that had been agreed upon at the reception a few days ago. Of course, Feng Ling had already set aside the weekend. However, because the weekend was specially free, she was especially busy in the past few days, so she didn't have much chance to visit little Momo. She could only occasionally confirm the child's safety based on the photos and text messages sent by the people taking care of little Momo in the hotel. In fact, there was nothing to confirm. After all, he was with Li Nanheng, and his safety was guaranteed. She only needed to make sure that the child was eating well and sleeping well. She wouldn't worry, nor would she worry when Liqing, who had just left America. The weekend. This time, Feng Ling did not go alone. Instead, she brought Qin Shuk to Mr. Mike's resort. After all, Mr. Mike was an outstanding figure in the American-Chinese business world. He was also a legendary figure in the older generation of the business world. He had hundreds of billions of assets under his name. Resorts that covered millions of square meters in the suburbs of Washington could be found all over the world. Furthermore, the decorations in each resort were luxurious, causing everyone who came in to be amazed. In this huge resort, there were all kinds of stadiums, entertainment venues, swimming pools, hot springs, sweatshops, fitness facilities, and so on. Mr. Mike invited everyone to come and arranged rooms for everyone. He asked everyone to stay here for the night to taste the 3 meals and service standards of the resort under his name. This is a true rich person. Qin Shuk walked beside Feng Ling, and the two of them retreated from the crowd in front of them. She whispered to Feng Ling, "I heard that Mr. Mike's assets have long surpassed Bill Gates, but he has never announced his assets to the public. Although he is famous in the business world, because he is too low-key, he has always been an invisible tycoon that everyone in the industry knows about. If it's the world capital, I think Mr. Mike is more qualified. Look here, this taste, this vision, and the one in front, it looks like a building decoration, but it's actually a statue of a severed arm from ancient Rome in the 80s. This kind of statue is enough to support a company that is about to go public, not to mention here. Look, there are so many of them. Many of them are from the last century. This is only the villa district in Washington. There will probably be many villas in other places. This shows that Mr. Mike is really super rich. This shows that Mr. Mike is really super rich. Fong Ling did not know much about these things, but Qin Shuk had studied abroad and had seen and heard a lot. Fong Ling only knew about these things after hearing them. She turned to look at the ancient Roman statue and asked softly, "Is it so expensive?" "Of course, a statue from the 80s. Do you think this is a joke?" Qin Shuk smacked her lips as she spoke. But then again, with the Fong Corporation's current reputation and situation, it's really an honor to be invited by Mr. Mike. This time, Fong Ling did not say anything. She only glanced at Mr. Mike, who was chatting and laughing with the people around him. His reputation is indeed great in the business circle, but Mr. Mike from America and Mr. Zan from England, who do you think is better? As she spoke, in order not to let others hear, Fong Ling leaned slightly to Qin Shuk's ear. "I think Mr. Zand is slightly better." Qin Shuk's lips twitched. "You're always so protective of your own people. No matter how powerful Mr. Zand is, he's so much younger than Mr. Mike. He's still a junior, and we're juniors among juniors. Mr. Mike is a legend, okay? When I was studying abroad, I saw Mr. Mike's photo in foreign textbooks. He's really a legend. No wonder you insisted on coming with me to the resort this time. So Mr. Mike is your idol?" Fong Ling glanced at her. Qin Shuk snorted. "Although there is indeed a reason, it's more because I want to accompany you, okay? I want to see if Li Nanheng will bring little brother K out. I heard that little brother K rarely returns to 11 base and often walks outside. Perhaps he's following Li Nanheng now?" Fong Ling chuckled and turned to walk in. Most of the people who came today were the group of people who were at CEO Yi's villa that day, but there were also some people Fong Ling had never seen before. However, it was obvious that their roles were not simple. Occasionally, when she heard their conversations as they passed by her, she could vaguely hear the companies they were talking about. When she heard the names of two very large groups in America, Fong Ling turned to look at them. Unexpectedly, the people from EDK Group and AW Group were also invited. It was said that even Shine Group had been invited. However, the MO family did not send anyone, and even Director MO did not appear. Almost all of the leaders of the top companies in the American Chinese community had arrived. It could be seen that Mr. Mike's strength could not be underestimated. What was the saying again? If you wanted to gain a foothold in a place, you had to pay respect to the doc first. Mr. Mike was this doc. However, although the old man accepted the initiative and fawning of so many people, he did not seem to pay much attention to this. For example, Fong Ling had not appeared in front of the old man before, nor had she greeted him. She was not like some of the female CEOs present who had been chatting with the old man with a smile and trembling. However, the old man did not seem to be affected by this. Fong Ling, who had not even smiled, was also included. She toured the resort. Every few steps, she could see various extravagant garden designs, as well as various souvenirs and ornaments worth over 100 million yuan. After walking for a long time, she walked into the front hall. Fong Ling stood at the back and did not squeeze forward, but she could hear Mr. Mike's voice coming from the microphone. His voice was old but powerful, and his opening remarks were exciting. When Fong Ling turned to look at the old man again, she accidentally met the ink-black eyes of the man sitting at the end of the seat. She paused and looked at Li Nanheng for a few seconds. She saw that the man, who was originally cold and indifferent to everything around him, seemed to have a faint smile in his eyes. "If you smile at Li Nanheng like this, I'm afraid he can send the whole world to you." Qin Shuk's words suddenly reverberated in his ears. Fong Ling abruptly retracted her gaze, but even if she did not look at him, she could feel that the man did not withdraw his gaze through the crowd. Chapter 1331. Everything was peaceful in the resort, but Feng Ling vaguely felt that something was amiss. Li Nanheng was used to holding a cigarette in his right hand and holding a cigarette in his right hand. Earlier, after coming out of the stadium, everyone was about to return to their rooms to change into light clothes so that they could relax here comfortably. She accidentally turned her head and saw that he was holding a cigarette in his left hand while his right hand was by his side. Feng Ling's sharp gaze landed on Li Nanheng's right hand. He was wearing a suit shirt and his sleeves covered his arm. She couldn't see anything. "What are you looking at?" Qin Shuk gently pushed her from behind. "Let's go and change. After entering the phone corporation with you, I haven't had the chance to go anywhere for a relaxing vacation. Now that I'm here, let's relax for 2 days. Shall we go to the hot spring later? By the way, I heard that the hot spring here is the type of hot spring plaza. It's not like the hot spring hotels outside, which are hidden and separated. The hot springs here are all in the same place, one small pool next to another. Thankfully, the swimsuits I brought are all conservative. Otherwise, those stinky men would have seen them all," Qin Shuk said as she pulled Feng Ling away. "I won't change into my swimsuit. Isn't there an office area beside the hot spring pool? I'll turn on the computer and accompany you. You still have to work when you're on vacation?" "I'm not interested in hot springs," Feng Ling said indifferently and entered the room. Qin Shuk knew her personality. Once she made up her mind, it was useless to persuade her. She simply changed into her swimsuit. Seeing that Feng Ling really took out her laptop, she was speechless. "You really brought the laptop over? And there are still some project documents I haven't read. I can accompany you while taking a look. Usually, I don't have the time to read these project documents. Today is just right." "All right then." When they arrived at the hot spring pool, there were indeed many small pools of nearly 1,000 square meters that had been modified on the flat ground. There were all kinds of colors, and the water was very clean. There were also all kinds of blue swimming pools around them. The contours of the swimming pools were all kinds of beautiful and exquisite shapes. Qin Shuk chose an aromatherapy hot spring pool. Coincidentally, there was no one in the small pool. There was a table and chairs beside the pool that could be used for work. Feng Ling placed the computer there, but Qin Shuk couldn't bear to watch her sitting here busy with work. She coaxed her into soaking her feet and even helped move the table and chair over. In the end, Feng Ling didn't refuse. She placed the table against the pool, rolled up her pants, and placed her calves into the hot spring water. As she soaked her feet, she turned slightly to look at the project documents on the computer. It was indeed very comfortable. Qin Shuk was also comfortable now. She soaked in the water and talked to her. Not long after, about half of the celebrities in the American Chinese circle who came here for vacation came here. Many people wanted to go to the gym to play for a while before coming. At this time, most of the women came. Everyone had nothing to do in their own pools. Occasionally, some people would talk about the recent events in the circle, and some people would whisper about which military base Li Nanheng was in. There were many different opinions about the Li family. CEO Li, walk slowly. CEO Li, do you not have a girlfriend? Do you mind finding a younger one? I've heard my father mention you. I like your personality, family background, and experience. If you don't accept me now, it's fine. Give me your number. Let's be friends first. CEO Li, do you have a girlfriend? Do you mind finding a younger one? Li Nanheng's eyes lit up, and he looked at Li Nanheng, who had just come out of the villa room in the resort. She followed him all the way. It's fine if you don't accept me now. Give me your number. We can be friends first. Li Nanheng was expressionless the entire time. He did not even look at the noisy girl who had been following him. Seeing that he did not even respond, the young lady of the O Corporation was not discouraged. She quickly followed his footsteps. Really, don't think I'm young. Although I'm 18 years old, I'm already very mature. I can also get married at this age in America. Assistant Yu Zheng, CEO Li, hey, CEO Li, don't ignore me. The young lady of the O family could not catch up to him, so she quickly jogged to catch up to him. Then, she blocked in front of Li Nanheng and stretched out her arms to raise her head to look at the tall and cold man in front of her. Finally, he glanced at her because of her sudden movement. The moment their eyes met, the young lady of the O family felt as though her heart had been struck. Her cheeks instantly heated up, and her voice trembled nervously. I just want to get to know you, and they all said that you don't have a girlfriend. Since you don't have a girlfriend, it's not a problem for me to chase you, right? I don't usually talk so much. I just want to get to know you, CEO Li, look. Li Nanheng looked at the young lady of the O family who was wearing a pink lace bikini in front of him. His expression did not change. Not interested. I'll be interested once I get to know you. The young lady of the O family smiled and was about to approach him. Her face was still a little red. However, the moment she approached, the man frowned. He took a step to the side and turned to walk in another direction. Hey, you? The young lady of the O family turned around and saw that she really couldn't tease this man. She immediately stomped her feet in anger and quickly ran after him. She didn't expect CEO Li to also go to the hot spring. The young lady of the O family happened to change into a swimsuit and wanted to go over. She happily moved forward and followed behind him as she said, CEO Li is going to the hot spring too? I'm going too. Why didn't you change your clothes? Li Nanheng acted as though he didn't hear her and walked forward. Yu Jing couldn't help but whisper, Miss O, our CEO Li has something to do there. Mr. Mike has asked CEO Li to have tea in the tea room next door, not to soak in the hot spring. Of course, he doesn't need to change his clothes. Oh, tea. I can drink tea too. CEO Li, I'll drink with you. As they spoke, they had already walked near the hot spring. They happened to pass by a small path to the tea room. Right now, the small path was filled with water. The young lady of the O family was focused on the tall man in front of her and didn't pay attention. She slipped and suddenly screamed. With a plop, she fell into the pool that was about 1.8 meters deep. Chapter 1332. The young lady of the O family was wearing a bikini, but she didn't seem to know how to swim. She struggled desperately in the pool and cried for help. Yu Zheng looked back and estimated that she was only a little more than 1.6 meters tall. There was indeed a possibility of drowning in this deep pool. He quickly called out to Li Nanheng, CEO Li. Hearing this, Li Nanheng turned back and saw the person who was struggling in the pool but did not sink for a long time. He did not speak. At this time, other people who were nearby had already surrounded them. They immediately shouted, Aya, isn't this the young lady of the O family? How did she fall into the pool? Quickly save her. Yes, hurry up and save her. There were a lot of onlookers. Most of them knew how to swim, but they kept shouting for others to save her, especially a young man who was shouting very loudly. He kept shouting, Aya, Miss O doesn't know how to swim. Hurry up and save her. CEO Li, I saw Miss O follow you here just now, right? Hurry up and save her. Li Nanheng replied expressionlessly. He glanced coldly at the person who was gradually sinking in the pool and signaled the young man who had just spoken to go down and save her. Seeing that CEO Li was really unmoved, the young man looked at the pool again and was about to jump in. Fortunately, at this moment, the manager of the resort's swimming pool area came over. When he saw the situation, he jumped down and pulled her out of the pool. The young lady of the O family was placed flat on the platform by the pool. A group of people surrounded her. The young man was afraid that she would reveal something because she was wearing so little, so he quickly pulled a towel over and covered her body. Then he patted her face and shouted, wake up, what should we do? CEO Li, Miss O did follow you here just now, didn't she? Why did she suddenly fall into the water? The young man turned around and suddenly asked anxiously. Li Nanheng glanced at him coldly. I was in a hurry here. You could even notice that she was following me. The young man's expression froze for a moment. He couldn't stand Li Nanheng's cold and sharp gaze that seemed to see through everything. He quickly retracted his gaze and continued to pat the unconscious young lady of the O family. What should we do? The people around were all saying that they needed to call an ambulance. Even Mr. Mike was alarmed and had already rushed over. Seeing that she was indeed unconscious, Li Nanheng took 2 steps closer and lowered his eyes to look at the young lady of the O family lying there. How long until the ambulance arrives? What do we do now? Artificial respiration, someone said. Yes, CPR. The young man suddenly raised his eyes and looked directly at Li Nanheng, who had just walked over. CEO Li, quick, help her with CPR. Li Nanheng frowned. Do you know how to do artificial respiration? Of course I won't. The young man said anxiously. Hurry up and save him, GM Li. Oh, I won't either. Yu Zheng almost laughed out loud. More and more people gathered here. Li Nanheng glanced at the young lady of the O family who was lying there and said without changing his expression, I remember that CEO Chen is a famous swimming enthusiast in the circle. He must be quite proficient in artificial respiration. Let CEO Chen do it. The young man turned to look. CEO Chen had a fat head and big ears. He was wearing tight black swimming trunks and was in his 40s. His face was covered with all kinds of red and unhealthy red pimples. They were of different sizes, and his face was dripping with water. When he heard this, he rushed forward to help save her. However, the young lady of the O family, who was still lying there, suddenly coughed at this moment. She quickly sat up before CEO Chen came over to help her with artificial respiration. She turned to look at Li Nanheng awkwardly, but Li Nanheng had already left without looking back. The hot spring pool where Feng Ling and Qin Shuk were in was relatively far from the swimming pool, so she was not clear about what was happening over there. Feng Ling was focused on the project documents on the computer, while Qin Shuk was drowsy in the pool. From beginning to end, she did not notice the boring episode over there. After returning to her room from the hot spring pool, Qin Shuk still wanted to go play golf. This time, Feng Ling did not accompany her. Seeing that she had been busy at the hot spring pool for the entire afternoon, Qin Shuk did not force her. She only told Feng Ling to remember to order some food for her when it was dinner time and left. Feng Ling turned off the computer and looked at the time. It was 5:00 in the afternoon. It was probably dinner time at 6 o'clock. After thinking for a moment, she called Li Nanheng, but he did not answer. She called Yu Zheng and learned that Li Nanheng had just returned to his room and was probably resting. After confirming that Li Nanheng was in his room, Feng Ling got up and walked out. Mr. Mike's resort was very big. It took more than 10 minutes to walk from her resort villa to Li Nanheng's villa. After entering, Yu Zheng saw her and quickly greeted her politely. Miss Feng. Is he still in the room? Yes, but CEO Li just said he wanted to rest. Are you looking for him, Miss Feng? Feng Ling nodded but did not explain. Yu Zheng was about to say something when he suddenly saw that she was holding a box of medicine in her hand. He immediately shut his mouth. He didn't expect that this Miss Feng, who usually looked cold and unapproachable, was quite observant. She could actually see that CEO Li's arm was injured. Do you have a room card? Feng Ling asked. Oh, yes. After all, Yu Zheng had personally seen how much CEO Li cared about Feng Ling. If it was anyone else, he definitely wouldn't dare to hand over the room card, but if it was Miss Feng, of course, it was a different story. After receiving the room card from Yu Zheng, Feng Ling thanked him and went to Li Nanheng's room. She gently knocked on the door twice, but no one responded. She swiped the card and went in. After entering, she heard the sound of water splashing from the bathroom. Feng Ling turned her gaze over and saw that although there was the sound of water, the bathroom door was open. As soon as she walked over, she saw the man standing inside, who was using his left hand to change his shirt with some difficulty. The shirt he had just changed into was stained with blood and was being washed underwater. He had just put on his new shirt, but because his left hand was not convenient, he had not buttoned it up. Suddenly hearing her approaching footsteps, the man in the bathroom abruptly raised his eyes and met her gaze. As expected, he hadn't used his right hand today because his arm was injured. Feng Ling walked over with the medicine. How did you get injured? Chapter 1333. Li Nanheng looked at her for a moment, then lowered his head to look at his arm. He gently moved it twice, silently indicating that the injury was not serious. It's okay. It's not a big problem. It's just a superficial wound. A superficial wound will make you unable to move your entire right hand for a day? Feng Ling had been injured before. She wouldn't be fooled so easily. She walked in and stood in front of him. Raise your hand. Let me take a look. Li Nanheng lowered his eyes to look at the woman who had already approached. He glanced at her long hair hanging behind her shoulders and then at her soft and comfortable clothes. It was clear that she had just returned to her room and was about to rest, but she suddenly came to his place. He smiled. Did you specially come to care about me? Feng Ling did not answer. She watched as he still did not dare to move his arm. She reached out and tugged at the unbuttoned sleeve of his shirt. When she saw that there was a circle of white gauze wrapped around it, extending from his wrist to his elbow, it could be seen that the area of the wound was very large. She paused and then raised her eyes to look at him. How did you get hurt? Meeting her sharp gaze, Li Nanheng smiled lightly. I met a sworn enemy from when I was on a mission in the base. The other party discovered my current whereabouts, and their revenge could be seen everywhere. I'm outside, unlike in the base. There are many things that I need to personally appear to ask about. No matter how careful I am, I will inevitably be ambushed. When I was surrounded, the other party had knives in their hands. Before I broke out of the encirclement, I was inevitably cut twice on my arm. Fortunately, the bones were not broken, but the cuts were a little deeper. If that was the case, the medicine she brought would be useless. Feng Ling placed the tube of wound medicine in her hand on the marble table beside the sink. Since you know you're being followed by your sworn enemy, why didn't you transfer people from the base over? Didn't you even arrange for a bodyguard to come to the resort this time? Li Nanheng smiled. Even bodyguards can't beat me. Why do I need them? At least there are more people. If something really happens, you don't have to break out of the encirclement alone. The people around you are all in the business circle. Assistant you probably doesn't know what to do when he encounters such a thing. Can't you arrange a few more people around you? Why didn't Xiao Su follow you? As Feng Ling spoke, she raised her hand to touch the gauze on his arm, but her fingers stopped a centimeter away. Afraid that she would hurt him, she simply put her hand down. Do you really care about me? The man looked down at her with a deep smile in his eyes. Feng Ling looked at him coldly. I noticed that there seems to be something wrong with your arm today. I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened. Coming over to ask is also a form of concern. Li Nanheng smiled with satisfaction. What should I do? It's probably because I've been ignored by you for too long. You just came over to look at me, and I'm so satisfied that I'm about to swell up. Feng. Crazy. Now that she had seen it, she knew what kind of injury it was and how it was injured. There was nothing to doubt. This kind of simple medicine was useless. She should just leave and go back to her room. Now that she had seen it, she knew what kind of injury it was and how it was injured. Aren't you afraid that the wound will get infected? She said in a muffled voice. Did you bring medicine and gauze over? I'll help you deal with it. Didn't you change the medicine on your arm when you came? It's still wet. Aren't you afraid that the wound will get infected? She said in a muffled voice. Did you bring medicine and gauze over? I'll help you deal with it. Li Nanheng looked down at her and did not speak. Feng Ling looked up at him. I'm talking to you, Li Nanheng. N? Ah, yes, I brought it, but I'll call you Jingyin. Don't reach out. Li Nanheng smiled. He was still smiling. Feng Ling rolled her eyes at him and did not waste any more time talking to him. She turned to look for Yu Zheng and asked for 2 kinds of medicine and gauze from him before returning. Seeing that the man was still standing in the bathroom, she wanted to call him out, but thinking that it was convenient to wash there, she walked into the bathroom, placed the things aside, and gestured for him to raise his hand. Li Nanheng looked at her for a while and did not resist. He raised his arm and handed it to her. Afraid of hurting him, she carefully untied the gauze. As she untied it, she saw that more and more blood seeped out. When the entire gauze was removed, she saw the 2 bone-deep wounds on his arm. Each one was about 7 or 8 centimeters long. With such deep wounds, no matter how good the medicine was, there would still be a lot of blood. Besides, he didn't rest at home even though he was injured. He actually came to this resort to participate in all kinds of social activities. Didn't she say that he didn't show up for these small activities? Feng Ling guessed a possibility. She only used a towel to avoid his wound and wiped the blood off his arm. Then she used a medical disinfectant cotton to wipe his wound clean. She picked up the medicine she brought and compared it with the medicine Yu Zheng had given her. She compared the effect of the 2 before helping him apply the medicine. The wound was so deep that it would definitely hurt a lot when applying the medicine, but Li Nanheng didn't seem to feel the pain. He just looked at her and watched her apply the medicine for him. It was as though all the time in this world had stopped. It was as though all he wanted was for Feng Ling to be safe in front of him. When she helped him wrap the gauze again, Li Nanheng suddenly smiled. What are you smiling at? Feng Ling glanced at him in confusion. It's been so long since you've touched these wounds. Your bandaging skills are not bad. You're not rusty, the man commented. Feng Ling didn't speak but continued to slowly bandage him. Although she had already left the circle and no longer had her friends and brothers get injured like before, and in this circle, it wasn't her body that got hurt, but her mind, after all, had already been deeply rooted in her bones. Although she hadn't touched these things for a long time, it didn't mean that she would forget how to bandage them. Although she hadn't touched them for a long time, it didn't mean that she would forget how to bandage them. Li Nanheng, I suggest you arrange some bodyguards by your side. Didn't you bring 2 last time at the villa? Why didn't you bring them to the resort this time? If I knew you were here, why would I bring bodyguards? If the 2 of us work together, how many people can beat us? She didn't know if the man was joking or serious, but when Feng Ling looked at him, she saw that his gaze and expression were serious. W. 4M. Chapter 1334. Feng Ling sneered and pointed at his bandaged arm. You're injured like this, and it's your right arm. Even if you fight me now, you might not be able to defeat me. Who do you think you are when your right arm can't exert any strength? You don't even have a foothold. I can knock you down in a few moves. Really? It's been a long time since I've seen it. Why don't you try knocking me down now? The man lowered his head and leaned close to her. Feng Ling raised her hand and pushed his forehead. I'm being serious. Don't get so close to me. I'm not being serious. Li Nanheng raised his brows and suddenly glanced meaningfully at the bed outside the bathroom. Otherwise, what do you think I meant by do it? Did you think wrongly? Li Nanheng. Feng Ling looked at him coldly. The man raised his brows. I'm listening. Feng Ling didn't want to talk to him anymore. She lowered her head to help him tie the gauze properly. After confirming that it was much better and that the gauze wouldn't be torn open because he was changing back and forth, she raised her head. All right, be careful. Don't touch the water again. As she spoke, she turned to take the shirt out of the sink. However, as she turned around, her long hair suddenly hooked onto the 2 buttons on the front of his shirt. She abruptly turned around and felt a pain on her head. She immediately paused and turned back in surprise. Li Nanheng also immediately lowered his head to look. Why are you entangled? At this moment, Feng Ling also glanced sideways and saw that a few strands of her hair were entangled in the buttons of his shirt. She quickly took a step back, but this time, she happened to bump into the man's arms. She raised her hand to pull her hair down, but Li Nanheng raised his hand at the same time. Don't pull so hard. Your hair will break. He had known Feng Ling for so many years, but this was the first time he had made such a scene because of her hair. Li Nanheng didn't know whether to cry or laugh. His right arm was inconvenient, so he could only raise his left hand to try to untie her hair. Wait a minute. Don't move. Let me do it. Feng Ling could only stand there without moving. She felt the man's hand carefully unraveling her hair, but after waiting for a few minutes, there was no effect. She turned her head again, but because of this movement, Li Nanheng suddenly frowned. I told you not to move. I was just about to untie it, but when I moved, it became even tighter. Feng Ling. It was not convenient for her to turn her head like this. No matter how long her hair was, it was not particularly long. When she turned her head like this, she could only see from the corner of her eye where it was entangled. However, it was actually quite difficult for her to turn around and untie it herself, unless her entire body was completely pressed against his arms. But even if she really pressed against him, she could not raise her hand to untie it. The man frowned. His left hand was not as nimble as his right hand to untie things. When she suddenly turned around, the ends of her hair that were about to be untied tightened again. This time, it was as though he had tied a dead knot. Can you untie it or not? If you can't, just break it. Feng Ling saw that he had been untying it for a long time and frowned. There's no need. Li Nanheng lowered his head and said seriously, such beautiful hair. My heart will ache if I break even one strand of it. Then you really don't have to. Normal people will lose dozens of hairs on average every day. No matter how good my hair is, I'm still a normal person. Do you have to feel sorry for me every day? As Feng Ling spoke, she reached out to pick up the small scissors she had used to cut the gauze and handed it to him. Just cut that strand. Li Nanheng didn't even look at the scissors she handed him. He only said, no. Feng Ling glanced at him. You did it on purpose? The man still lowered his head and seriously untied her hair. Your hair is on your body. How could I do it on purpose? Feng Ling, she didn't speak. Anyway, she would untie it sooner or later. She stood there silently and let him untie it. However, her hair was a little wavy now. It was easy for it to become a dead knot if she accidentally wrapped it around his buttons. Li Nanheng didn't want to break her hair. It took him more than 10 minutes to untie one button. There was another button that was even tighter. He continued to untie it. At this moment, there was suddenly a knock on the door. Yu Zheng's voice came from outside. CEO Li, Mr. Mike is here. He's outside. He wants to see you. Mr. Mike? He came at this time? Feng Ling's heart skipped a beat. Mr. Mike was a famous figure in the American business circle. More importantly, she wasn't familiar with him. Mr. Mike had probably only heard some rumors about her and Li Nanheng, but people at his age didn't care much about these rumors. However, if he saw her tugging at the disheveled Li Nanheng in the bathroom, would she still be able to survive in the business world in the future? She quickly tried to tear off the strand of hair. Seeing her motive, Li Nanheng frowned and pressed her down. It's too late for you to go out now. Don't pull. Feng Ling turned to look at him, frowned, and lowered her voice. What do we do now? It won't matter if I'm seen. I'm unmarried and you're unmarried. Everyone outside says that I'm your fiancé. What are you afraid of? The man looked confident. Feng Ling glared at him. I don't want to be seen. Then hide. When Li Nanheng heard the sound of the door, he immediately lowered the bathroom curtain and pushed Feng Ling in. Then he stood outside the curtain and lowered his head to untie her hair. How can I hide like this? Feng Ling didn't understand, but she had already entered behind the curtain. Her body was blocked by the curtain, and only a strand of hair was pulled on his button. However, the man's body also blocked this side. His back was facing the outside of the bathroom, so he shouldn't be able to see anything. After all, this was Mr. Mike's place. Yuzheng only knocked on the door to inform him and couldn't say too much to stop him. Mr. Mike had already walked in. Hearing the footsteps outside and Mr. Mike's smiling voice, Feng Ling suddenly became nervous. If it was just the two of them talking in the room, it would be fine. However, Li Nanheng's shirt was not buttoned and his clothes were disheveled. She also came in her underwear and did not look like she was here to talk about work. Furthermore, she was in the bathroom with her hair tangled up. It looked as ambiguous as it could be. Especially now that she was still hiding behind the curtain of the bathroom. If she was discovered in this situation, there was no guarantee that she would be in trouble. She looked around the bathroom, but there was no other place to hide behind the curtain. Don't move. Li Nanheng shouted in a low voice that only she could hear. His fingers continued to fight on his button. W. 4M. Chapter 1335. Feng Ling had no choice but to stop moving. When Mr. Mike had already walked out of the bathroom, Feng Ling's entire body tensed up. Coincidentally, at this moment, Li Nanheng tugged down the buttons on his shirt with force. Feng Ling's hair instantly regained its freedom. She took a step back into the curtain and the curtain blocked her. At this moment, Li Nanheng turned to look at the person outside the bathroom. He was still holding the button that he had just pulled off. Mr. Mike looked at Li Nanheng in surprise. What's wrong? I was slightly injured. I just bandaged it. Li Nanheng's expression was calm and indifferent, as though there was nothing behind the curtain. He turned around and walked out. At the same time, he casually tugged at the collar of his shirt. It's not convenient to wear clothes with my left hand. I just put on the shirt, but the button scratched a hook in the bathroom and was torn off. I have to change into another one later. It's troublesome. Mr. Mike finally understood. I see. Then change your clothes first. Li Nanheng responded indifferently. He turned around to get another shirt and changed into it. During this time, Mr. Mike asked if he needed help. Li Nanheng sighed and smiled. It's fine, there's no need. Feng Ling frowned when she heard this. Why was he still trying to be brave? Since it was inconvenient for his left hand, he asked Mr. Mike to help him wear it. The old man didn't even mind, but he was trying to be brave himself. After listening for a while, she suddenly heard Li Nanheng close the bathroom door outside. It was good to close it. This way, she wouldn't be too stiff inside. She heard the man's footsteps getting further and further away. His room was quite big, and there were a few suites suitable for drinking tea and talking. He probably went there. Feng Ling walked out from behind the curtain and leaned against the bathroom door to listen for a while. She hesitated if she should leave now, but if she bumped into Mr. Mike or Mr. Mike's secretary and assistant saw her outside, forget it. She turned back to look at the shirt in the sink. She took advantage of the soundproofing of the bathroom and walked over to wash the shirt. Although this kind of high-end shirt couldn't be washed, it was already soaked in water anyway. He couldn't take it out dripping wet. He had to wash it first. Otherwise, there was nothing to do. Qin Shuk sent her a message asking if she had rested. Feng Ling replied that she was outside and not in the room. If she wanted to eat anything for dinner, she could order it in the kitchen of the resort later. Qin Shuk then sent another photo. In the photo was her gym in the resort. Many young handsome men were exercising there. She specially took a few photos of them and sent them to her. I didn't expect that the big shots in the business circle that Mr. Mike invited weren't all bald old men with beer bellies. There were also so many handsome young men with good figures. Feng Ling looked at it speechlessly and replied, "You playboy, don't you want your little brother K anymore? K is on missions all day and is busy in the base. He's so straight that it's scary. When I'm free, I send him a message to ask him out for a meal, but he's embarrassed. He's too boring. Although he's handsome, he's not suitable for me. How can there be that many interesting men? Yes, yes. Look at this." Qin Shuk sent another photo of a young man's back. "Isn't this handsome?" Feng Ling, "It's just a back. You're asking me if he's handsome? I've seen the front, but he's talking to someone with his back to me. It's not appropriate for me to take a photo from the front, right?" Qin Shuk continued, "I heard that he's from China. He seems to be the current head of the Ling Xiao group. His name is something like Xiao. Xiao something. I heard him talking to those celebrities. I feel that this man is super charming. I just don't know if he's married." Ling Xiao group? Feng Ling's hand that was holding the phone paused for a moment as though she had thought of something. Xiao Li. "Ah, yes, 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 this little brother's background is very wild. His name is also so wild, ha ha ha. He clearly doesn't look easy to get along with, but his words are very humorous. I think he's something." Feng Ling sighed with a smile. Wasn't this the person who Jin Wan had secretly discussed with her as her biological brother? Later, it seemed that he was indeed her biological brother. It was said that this young master of the Xiao family was not someone to be trifled with. His temper was very bad. The point was, why did she remember that this young master of the Xiao family had some conflicts with Qin Sighting? Control yourself. Don't flirt with just anyone. Feng Ling could only say this to her. "Io, don't worry. I'm reliable." Was Qin Shuk reliable? The little love-struck fool who couldn't move when she saw a good-looking man. Feng Ling chuckled inwardly. Mr. Mike sat with Li Nanheng for about an hour. She didn't know what they talked about. Later, Feng Ling really had nothing to do in the bathroom, so she took out her phone and played various small games that Qin Shuk had downloaded for her. She had never played these before and thought it was very simple, but in the end, she found that she knew nothing about them. She couldn't even pass the various checkpoints. She was using the little person in her phone to try her best to jump up, but she failed again and again. Suddenly, the bathroom door was pulled open. The first thing Li Nanheng saw when he opened the door was Feng Ling, who was usually cold and avoiding people, squatting in the bathroom and playing small games on her phone. She was playing very seriously. The man raised his good-looking eyebrows. Seeing that she hadn't noticed that he had come in, he walked over and bent down behind her. "Press left, left, up. Yes, left, left, right. Change to the right this time. Yes, 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 just like this. Keep your fingers pressed down and don't let go. Right." Feng Ling kept jumping up according to Li Nanheng's instructions. When the words finally appeared on her phone, she let out a long breath and suddenly paused. She turned her eyes abruptly and almost hit the man's chin. Li Nanheng was bending down to look at her. When he suddenly turned his head and looked at her closely, the man raised his eyebrows. Feng Ling quickly stood up, but after squatting for a long time, her legs were a little numb. She reached out to the marble platform by the side, stabilized her body, and put the phone back into the small pocket of her clothes. She then looked out. Mr. Mike left? He left. Then I should go too. Feng Ling glanced at his arm again. He was wearing a shirt and she couldn't see the gauze inside. However, he didn't touch the water and didn't make any big movements. She walked around him and walked out. However, she had only taken 2 or 3 steps when the man stretched out his long arm and held her with his injured arm. He pulled her back. Feng Ling noticed his arm and subconsciously didn't dare to struggle too hard. She quickly stabilized her body that almost fell back into his arms and turned to look at him. Li Nanheng lowered his eyes. Because of this half hug, he looked at her closely. It's already dinner time. Why don't you stay for dinner before leaving? Seeing that Fong Ling's hair is working so hard, let's leave a monthly ticket before leaving, okay? W. 4M. Chapter 1336. I won't eat. Shook will eat with me when she comes back from the gym. I can't leave her alone. I believe that as long as she knows that you're having dinner with me, she'll be happy to be left alone. The man didn't let go of her. Instead, he stretched out his other arm and hugged her from behind. However, he didn't hug her tightly. He just held her loosely like this. His voice was pressed against the back of her ear. It was warm and light, but it also had a faint hoarseness that belonged to him. Fong Ling actually wanted to ask when he had bribed Qin Shuk. However, after thinking about it, a girl with a temper like Qin Shuk's couldn't be easily bribed. She was probably really willing. This was even more difficult to deal with. For some reason, there was a little fangirl who wanted to help Gu Nanheng. Stay, just for dinner, N? The man's voice was still pressed against her ear. You came to help me bandage my wound. I should treat you to a meal to thank you. This is Mr. Mike's place. What kind of treat are you? You mean, after we leave the resort, if I say I want to treat you to a meal, will you come out to see me alone? Fong Ling's expression was cold. Forget it. What do you want to eat? The man curved his lips behind her and raised his hand to touch her head, just like in the past. However, in the past, her short hair was soft and fluffy. Now, it was still soft, but it was long hair, which made his heart itch uncontrollably. The kitchen in the resort has sent a menu to every room. It's probably with Yu Zheng. Go tell Yu Zheng and order a few dishes. Let's eat, Li Nanheng said as he buttoned his shirt cuffs. As Li Nanheng spoke, he buttoned up his shirt cuffs. Suddenly, he seemed to have thought of something and said casually, give me 2 more bottles of older red wine. You know I can't hold my liquor well. Why do you want red wine? Fong Ling turned back to look at him. The man was still buttoning up his shirt. He looked so focused that she couldn't see anything. He didn't even raise his head. You've been in the business circle for so long, but you haven't even trained your alcohol tolerance. How are you going to survive? Since I can train you from a little girl with low stamina to a sniper with high stamina and endurance in swimming, I can also train your alcohol tolerance. Even if you drink too much at my place, nothing will happen. At most, I will take advantage of you. Besides, it's not like you haven't slept with me before. If something really happens, you won't lose anything. It's much better than getting drunk at other places. Fong Ling listened to the man's shameless words and did not move. She only watched him coldly. Sensing that she didn't order, Li Nanheng glanced at her again and smiled faintly. I'm just joking. I won't do anything to you even if I drink too much. Drink some red wine to liven things up. I'll get Qin Shuk to pick you up later. Do you think I can trust you? Fong Ling was expressionless. So, am I really a beast in your eyes? Li Nanheng asked. Fong Ling paused. Animal? She could be considered one, but she couldn't be considered one. What he did to her when he drove up the mountain was indeed beastly, but from the way he made it up to her, she could tell that he was really angry and agitated. They had known each other for so many years, and that was the only time he had been agitated. Considering all the things that had happened in the past, she didn't take it to heart. By now, that little bit of anger had long faded away. Although Fong Ling did not speak, she turned to look for Yu Zheng. After taking the menu, she ordered a few dishes that she and Li Nanheng were used to eating. After thinking for a few seconds, she said, ask them to send 2 bottles of red wine over. I want them to be older. If the price is too expensive, I'll pay for it. There's no need for Mr. Mike to spend so much money. All right. Yu Zheng nodded and did not ask anything else. He followed Fong Ling's request and went out to call for help. When she returned to her room, she suddenly heard Li Nanheng's phone ring. She turned to look at him. The man picked up his phone, looked at the caller ID, and picked up the call. From his tone, it should be about work, so Fong Ling did not disturb him. She went back to the bathroom and took out the shirt she had washed earlier. She looked around and finally found an ironing machine and a folding table for ironing clothes in the cabinet by the bathroom. She opened the folding table, plugged in the ironing machine, and took out the shirt she had just washed to try to iron it. After Li Nanheng put down the phone, he turned back to see Fong Ling standing there to iron his clothes. The young and inexperienced boy in the past had now become a pure little woman. Because she was bent over, her long hair spread out on her shoulders and behind her back, getting in the way from time to time. She had to raise one hand to push back the long hair on one side, or use her fingers to tuck the long hair on her cheeks behind her ears. Her movements were natural and skillful. She was wearing a set of very soft white clothes. Although it was not a skirt, it had a bit of gauze texture, which inexplicably made her look like a fairy. Her face without any makeup was excessively fair and tender. A pair of clear and bright eyes were seriously looking at the shirt on the flat table as she slowly moved the ironing machine. This scene was like a husband who had just returned home from work and saw his wife washing and ironing his clothes. After tossing and turning for so many years, at this moment, Li Nanheng suddenly understood what he wanted. Whether it was in the base, the cabin he built in the jungle, or now. What he wanted was to give Fong Ling a stable home. Whether she wanted to live a peaceful life at home without worrying about anything or to go out, he had to at least give her a complete and safe home behind her. She didn't have to wander around like when she was young and could enjoy everything in his world. When Fong Ling lowered her head to iron the clothes, she was too focused because she rarely ironed clothes. In the past, when she was in the base, she was not in the business circle. She just needed to wash her clothes clean and didn't need to be neat and exquisite. After returning to the Fong family, there were servants, secretaries, and assistants by her side. There was no need for her to do this kind of thing. She only got drenched in the rain twice when she was on a business trip and rushed back to her room to iron it twice. The first time, she accidentally burned her clothes. She was too focused. When Li Nanheng approached, she was still looking down at the clothes. As she ironed, she said, "This kind of shirt can only be taken to a high-end laundry outside for dry cleaning or washed in other ways. I don't know if it can still be worn after washing. Let me iron it first." Chapter 1337. However, as soon as Fong Ling's voice fell, the man suddenly held her waist. The moment she paused, he pressed her into his arms. Fong Ling asked in a low voice, "What are you doing?" Before she could finish her words, the man's burning kiss pressed down. Li Nanheng held her waist with one hand and clasped her chin with the other, forcing her to raise her head and accept his surging kiss. Fong Ling's lips were slightly open because she hadn't finished speaking. As a result, he easily pried open her teeth, entangled her tongue, pressed against the root of her tongue, and sucked hard as though he wanted to swallow her whole. Fong Ling anxiously grunted. Her instinctive reaction was to quickly turn off the power of the ironing machine. Otherwise, the shirt would definitely be ruined. Under her resistance, the man seemed to instantly understand her main intention. He still held her tightly with one hand and reached out with the other to press the switch under the ironing machine. As he cut off the power, he held her tightly. Li Nanheng's domineering kiss almost swept away all her dazed emotions. His hot and strong breath filled her mouth, causing her entire body to tremble instinctively. All her strength seemed to be taken away by this man in an instant. Fong Ling's legs softened. As the man's kiss deepened, it inexplicably reminded her of the time when she lived in the jungle. Every time she wanted to sleep well at night, he would kiss her until her entire body went limp and she had no choice but to go to bed with him. It was precisely because of those memories that Fong Ling's entire body instinctively softened because of the familiar feeling of the past. Because he kissed her too fiercely, his heavy breathing brushed against her facial features, forcing her to unknowingly burst into tears. More importantly, the man carried her and turned to sit on the fabric sofa at the side. She was forcefully pressed onto his lap and held in his arms. There was almost no space between the two of them, and they were tightly pressed against each other. The place under her body that was pressed against her was an existence that couldn't be ignored. As the man kissed her deeply, it became more and more aggressive. It was as though he was ready to give her a fatal blow at any time. Fong Ling pressed her hands against the man's hard chest. She could only hear his deep breathing and the ambiguous sound of their lips and tongues touching. Even her resisting whimpers were completely blocked by his mouth. Li Nanheng's scorching palm was branded on her waist. As though he was still not satisfied, his hand moved heavily on her body. Fong Ling was forced to lean against him to welcome another wave of hot kisses. After a long time, Li Nanheng finally let go of her red and swollen lips. He panted, his deep and dark gaze still on her face. At this time, Fong Ling was finally able to take a good breath. She had to admit that her entire body was soft, and her cheeks were red. Her black and white eyes seemed to have been washed several times, hazy and glistening with tears. More importantly, her eyes were a little dazed. It was as though she had only been ironing clothes. Why was she suddenly carried over and kissed for so long? She felt as though her soul had left her body. She felt as though she had returned to the jungle. She was busy with the small matters in the cabin all day, busy with eating and dressing, and at the same time, being carried and kissed by this man at any time. Seeing that she had not returned to her senses for a long time, Li Nanheng held her face, his Adam's apple moved, and he kissed Fong Ling's lips again. You. Fong Ling suddenly returned to herself and quickly pressed her hands against his chest to prevent him from approaching. Her voice was a little broken from the kiss. Li Nanheng, you, if he continued kissing her, she really couldn't take it. Li Nanheng had always been very aggressive, but he had always restrained all his aggression in front of her and weakened his strong and domineering instincts. But now, this man who no longer suppressed everything made her almost unable to resist. 10 months ago, she didn't expect that he would be in the car. Now she knew that this man could really do anything when he didn't restrain himself. A red light lit up in her heart, warning her that this man would push her down on the bed at any time. Even if his arm was injured, he could still press her here and do whatever he wanted. In the past, he was always too polite to her, and now, Li Nanheng was often too rude to her. Because of her struggle, Li Nanheng only paused for a moment before pressing her hands down. He did not allow her to refuse and continued kissing her. He bit her lips and kissed her until her head was dizzy. The wall of sobriety seemed to have been shattered. No. She only came to see the situation because of his arm injury. It was not like what Qin Shuk had said. Instead of smiling at those difficult partners all day, it was better to treat Li Nanheng better. She only came to see his injury. She did not want to offer herself up, nor did she want to make a deal with him. But what was this? Why was she suddenly kissed again? She was just ironing clothes. Fong Ling's mind was in a mess. When he finally let go of her, the woman in his arms was stunned and didn't come back to herself for a long time. She didn't drink at all, but she looked drunk and her cheeks were red. Fong Ling didn't know what to say. She didn't drink at all, but she looked drunk and blushed. You don't like it? He bit her earlobe, his voice low and husky. It was extremely sexy. Fong Ling was about to speak when the man chuckled softly. His smile was clear and hoarse. Why aren't you speaking? Why did you have to iron my clothes like a little wife? I couldn't help it. I forced myself not to pull you onto the bed. I just sat on the sofa and kissed you for a while. What's with your gaze? It's as if I've bullied you. I'm coaxing you like this. How do I look like I'm bullying you? As he spoke, he pressed her even more tightly in his arms, letting her feel the urgency somewhere in his body. Fong Ling's body immediately stiffened and she quickly stood up. The man looked at her familiar appearance and didn't want to feel all the changes in his body. He then looked at her red and swollen lips and messy hair and couldn't help chuckling softly. He stroked her cheek and his hot breath brushed against her face. If you have the patience to iron my clothes, why can't you have some patience to feel my heart for you? How long do you want to keep me cold? Fong Ling quickly stood up. Halfway up, she was pulled back into his arms by the man. This time, she did not sit on him but lay down in his arms. Chapter 1338. Li Nanheng hugged her and was about to kiss her when the phone in the room suddenly rang. He paused and felt the warm and fragrant jade in his arms. He panted heavily and his black eyes locked onto Fong Ling's face. She seemed to be still in a daze, but because of the ringing of the phone, her eyes instantly regained clarity. She quickly pressed her hands on his shoulders and quickly stepped back to stand up. Li Nanheng let out a long breath. His handsome face was extremely dark at this moment. He picked up the phone and said grumpily, "Speak." The resort staff on the other end of the line could hear the unfriendliness in his tone. She was stunned for a moment and immediately said carefully, Mr. Li, the food and red wine in your room are ready. Should I send it over now or do you want to come out to the restaurant to eat?" Hearing the word, red wine, the displeasure in Li Nanheng's eyes lessened. "Send it over." "All right, I'll send it over right away." "Sorry to disturb you, Mr. Li." The other party carefully hung up the phone. Li Nanheng hung up the phone at the same time and let out a sigh of relief. He lowered his head to look at the place where he was still arrogant and turned to look behind him. He saw that Fong Ling had gone to the clothes again as though nothing had happened. She picked up the ironing machine, turned on the switch, and lowered her head to continue ironing. She didn't run? Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows and hid the slight surprise in his eyes. He turned back to the bathroom and simply washed his face with cold water. A few minutes later, someone knocked on the door. Yu Zheng came over with the staff who delivered the food. The staff pushed the dining cart with dishes that Li Nanheng and Fong Ling liked to eat. At the same time, it suited their tastes. There were also 2 bottles of red wine that were more than 9 years old. If they wanted red wine that was older, they would have to order more than 9 years old. This was not bad either. Li Nanheng nodded, indicating that they could leave. The staff member and Yu Zheng did not dare to look at Fong Ling. They all lowered their heads and silently retreated. Li Nanheng glanced at the dining cart again. "After all, we've lived together for too many years. Only you and I understand each other's tastes so well." Fong Ling had just turned off the ironing machine and picked up the ironed clothes. Hearing his words, she raised her eyes to look over. When she saw the food on the dining car, she understood what he was talking about. "Didn't you say you wanted to eat together? We have to eat something that both you and I can eat." She didn't avoid the topic and turned to hang up the clothes again. "It's ironed. Try it on the next time you wear it. If you can still wear it, then wear it. If you can't, then dispose of it. You ironed it yourself. Even if I can't wear it, I have to wear it." The man pushed the dining cart to the dining table and placed the dishes on the table one by one. Fong Ling went over to help. After putting it away, Li Nanheng opened a bottle of red wine. In order not to let Fong Ling notice his intention to get her drunk, he poured her a small glass and said, "Try it. How does it taste?" Fong Ling saw that the red wine was only at the bottom of the glass, so she picked it up and drank it. After tasting it, she said, "It's very delicious." "Really?" Li Nanheng poured himself a glass and tasted it. It was indeed not bad. He asked her, "Do you want more?" Fong Ling glanced at him. "You ordered 2 bottles and asked me if I wanted more." The man smiled, but he smiled because this girl would never escape his trap. He poured her more than half a glass and carefully reminded her, "Drink slowly. Don't drink too fast." Fong Ling did not speak. She sat down and picked up the cutlery. Without saying much, she ate as though she was about to leave. Li Nanheng did not say much. The entire dinner was very peaceful. The dishes tasted good, and the taste was what both of them liked. Li Nanheng drank a lot of the 2 bottles of wine. Fong Ling saw that he did not seem drunk. With his alcohol tolerance, it was indeed not easy for him to get drunk, but her alcohol tolerance was, however, this wine was really delicious. Although her alcohol tolerance was not good, the more she tried to control herself from drinking, the more she couldn't control herself when she encountered such delicious red wine. Li Nanheng knew that Feng Ling's alcohol tolerance was not good, so he did not urge her to drink. He just sat there and drank slowly. During this period, Feng Ling also poured 2 glasses for herself. After 2 glasses, she seemed to be controlling herself and did not touch it for a long time. However, seeing that Li Nanheng had drunk more than half of the wine, she couldn't help but pour another glass and sip slowly. She was like a child who knew that she could not eat too much sugar but was afraid that it would be bad to eat too much, so she could only take small bites. She was so cute that Li Nanheng felt his heart ache. In the end, Feng Ling almost drank half of the 2 bottles of wine. She realized that she had drunk a lot. The bottle of red wine was not small, and the capacity was not small. She immediately put down the wine glass and did not dare to touch it again. She turned to drink the soup. Li Nanheng sat quietly opposite her. He had been eating and drinking well. He just looked at her quietly. Feng Ling's face turned red. She suddenly put down the cutlery, stood up, and said, "I'm done eating. I'm going back." Li Nanheng still sat in his original position. He crossed his arms and quietly watched her turn to walk out. The direction of her walking was very accurate, directly toward the door. Her steps were very steady, but the video was a little straight. The man raised his eyebrows. Feng Ling, N. Feng Ling did not look back, nor did she stop walking. She was almost at the door. "How old are you this year?" the man suddenly asked. Feng Ling was about to leave, but she was suddenly stumped by his question. She immediately stopped in her tracks as though she was seriously recalling how old she was. Seeing that she was drunk again, the smile on Li Nanheng's lips deepened. He stood up and slowly walked over. Standing behind her, he lowered his eyes to watch her deep in thought and then looked at her clear eyes that were staring straight at the wall. 20. Feng Ling thought seriously for a long time. 23 or 24, and it's going to be my 24th birthday soon, the man said softly. So don't give me the cold shoulder anymore. Let's spend the rest of our lives together. What do you think? Feng Ling stood there for a long time, put down her hand, and did not speak. Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows and glanced at her again, only to see that the little woman suddenly turned to look at him with a displeased expression. Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows at her dazed but bright eyes. What's wrong? I'm not giving you the cold shoulder. Chapter 1339. Oh. I'm just angry. And then when will you calm down? The drunk little woman turned her head proudly. I don't know. Anyway, I haven't calmed down yet. Li Nanheng smiled and touched her fair little face. You've been angry for long enough. At that time, I just wanted to resolve the matter as soon as possible. I didn't expect that I would end the battle quickly and hurt you badly. I also blame myself, but didn't I come out with you now? Feng Ling ignored him. Li Nanheng still touched her face. Tell me, what do I have to do to appease your anger? Feng Ling stood there without moving, but she lowered her head slightly. No one knew what she was thinking. Seeing her seriously thinking, Li Nanheng stroked her chin with his hand and stood in front of her, blocking her way. At the same time, he felt it was funny. After Feng Ling was drunk, as long as she did not fall asleep, she usually looked the same as when she was sober, but in fact, every time her eyes and her state were obviously different. For example, her sharp eyes were very quiet and peaceful at this time. They were not dull, but they seemed to have returned to her own nature. They were very quiet, and her expression was also not aggressive. She would look at him and blink at him. Although she would lose her temper sometimes, at least she would not pretend to be cold to him. Especially when Feng Ling's eyes were open. Because her eyes were clear and bright, her pupils were black and bright, and her gaze was often cold. People liked to look at her. However, when she closed her eyes, the outline of her face became much gentler, as though she was a little fairy who had fallen asleep, quiet and clear as though she could not be violated by anyone. But the more he thought of Phong Ling when she was drunk, especially that time in Cambodia, Li Nanheng seemed to have an indescribable excitement in his heart. For some reason, he had a premonition that he would be able to see the cute side of Phong Ling again. He pulled her back to the sofa and then sat next to her, patiently waiting for her to say a way to appease her anger. But it wasn't easy for Phong Ling to sit so obediently next to him. It was absolutely impossible for him to do nothing. He had to do something to make him happy. He reached out to hold her in his arms, but Phong Ling sat there without moving as if still trying to think of a way to appease her. After a long while, when the man leaned close to her ear and kissed her earlobe, she said softly, "It's really hard to survive in the business world. I don't think I'm suitable for this circle. Although the Phong Corporation can be maintained, it's not easy to maintain outside, especially when it comes to financing. It's very difficult." How hard is it? Li Nanheng gently patted her shoulder and lowered his eyes to look at the little woman who was obediently held in his arms. Seeing that she did not resist and let him do whatever he wanted, he smiled. "I can learn a lot of business knowledge and learn how to manage a company, but I can't learn how to smile at others, nor can I learn how to interact with others. I heard that some partners like to touch their female partner's buttocks," Phong Ling said seriously. "Although I've never seen such a scene, nor have I seen it at Jean Wan's place, Jean Wan's EQ is very high. She usually avoids such things, and she won't cooperate with those partners who have bad habits, but she has the capital, but I don't. Even if I know that the partner has bad intentions, I have to come to talk about financing, but I'm already here, but I can't put down my face and keep smiling. I think it's really difficult." With that, Phong Ling turned to look at him, her eyes filled with grievance. "You shouldn't have let me leave the base. I don't have a way back now. I don't like to work in the business circle. I want to be myself." Li Nanheng's handsome and cold brows moved. He patted her shoulder and gently stroked her head. If he hadn't seen through everything, he wouldn't have rushed over to accompany her to Washington. "I know, but the Phong family can't be destroyed. I know, but the Phong family can't be destroyed. This is your only home. Your parents are not here. If you're not willing to bear these burdens, I can accompany you. You only need to bear the title of the Phong Corporation in name. I can help you with everything, but you're not willing," Phong Ling said. The man patiently whispered in her ear, "It's not too late now. As long as you're willing to nod, I can help you take over everything you don't like. You can still be yourself. No one will dare to force you, including me. But Grandpa and Grandma have high hopes for me." Phong Ling lowered her eyes. "They're like you. They hope that I can be the towering tree of the Phong family. You can think of it this way. I have high hopes for you to support the Phong family with your own ability. But if you change your way of thinking and find a good husband with your own ability, and your husband accompanies you and helps you, the result will be the same, won't it? The two of them won't be disappointed. At the same time, they'll be very happy to be able to solve your life's biggest problem." The man persuaded her. Phong Ling was in a daze. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" Li Nanheng asked by her ear with a smile in his eyes. Phong Ling did not nod or shake her head. She just sat there quietly. Li Nanheng continued to lean close to her and said, "Think about it. As long as the two of us get married, the Phong family and the Li family will be truly connected. With the Li family around, who dares to do anything to the Phong family? Who dares to ask you to smile at those partners who have bad habits? With me around, you, a tree, can still grow strong and healthy. You can clearly be in front of me, basking in the sunlight, but you have to be angry at me. You have to grow in the cold and gloomy canyon by yourself. Don't you feel tired? It's not that you can't go back to 11 base, it's just that you don't have that title anymore. Didn't I ask you to participate in the battle last time when Jean Wan was in trouble? You're no different from the people in the base. I'm doing everything for you. Can't you feel sorry for me? Why do you always leave me hanging like this? I've never treated any woman like this in my F***king life, ugh. Fong Ling abruptly raised her hand to cover his mouth. Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows and looked at her. And when he said that she was wrong and that she was ignoring him, she refused to listen. She was so drunk, yet she still refused to listen to what she didn't want to hear. She even reached out to cover his mouth to stop him from speaking. What was wrong with him to have loved this evil woman for so many years? Chapter 1340. Li Nanheng took a deep breath in her palm. The pent-up emotions that he had been tortured by this woman for so many years suddenly surged up. She was bad, but he was worse than her. And so, Fong Ling trembled when the man suddenly licked her palm. She stared at him blankly. What are you doing? The man raised his brows. She did not move her hand away, and his actions were even more excessive. She quickly retracted her hands. Her face was already slightly red from the alcohol, and now it was even redder. She abruptly stood up and looked like she was about to leave. However, before she could take a step, Yu Zheng knocked on the door. Fong Ling was stunned again. She suddenly turned back to look at Li Nanheng and said, "Is Mr. Mike here again?" Li Nanheng, it was obvious that Yu Zheng was knocking on the door. He was probably preparing to come in and take away the dining car. Was her memory messed up after drinking too much, or was it because the incident of hiding from Mr. Mike had left a deep impression on her? Then Fong Ling abruptly reached out to drag Li Nanheng, who was sitting on the sofa, and pushed him toward the bedroom. After entering the bedroom, she hurriedly pushed him onto the bed. Li Nanheng, hide in. She pushed him onto the bed, lifted the blanket, and covered him with it. Then she turned back to look at the bedroom door. As though she was avoiding an enemy, she carefully ran down and locked the door. Then she returned to the bed and looked at the man who had revealed his head from under the blanket. She was about to speak when she suddenly froze. No, I should be the one hiding. Li Nanheng raised his brows and looked at the little cutie in front of him. He patted the spot beside him and made an inviting gesture. Yes, do you want to come in and hide? All right. She answered very quickly. After all, his arm was injured, but she was not. She nimbly took off her shoes and went to bed. She lifted the blanket and covered herself with it. She lay down beside him and held her breath to prevent others from discovering her. The quilt covered both of them in darkness. The air was thin and very quiet. They were too close. In such a narrow space with little air, Fong Ling's heartbeat could almost be heard. It was very quiet. It's hot, too. The whole world seemed to be isolated by this quilt, but it also seemed like this kind of belonging gave people a strange sense of security. She stayed under the blanket for a while, but she didn't hear anything. She thought about it and quickly lifted the blanket to take another look. However, just as she raised her hand to lift the blanket, the man beside her, whose breathing had gradually become heavy, suddenly turned over and pressed her down. The blanket was still not lifted. In this dark and narrow space, it was a little stuffy and hot, but the man's scorching kiss pressed down without hesitation. Fong Ling lay motionless and accepted the man's kiss. She just looked at him in the darkness. Li Nanheng did not lift the quilt but kissed her deeply under the stuffy quilt. Again and again, he teased her lips and tongue, deep, entangled, and reluctant to part. When Fong Ling struggled to push him away from the quilt because she couldn't breathe, he seemed to have sensed her intentions in an instant. He did not let go of her but lifted the quilt to give her space to breathe and then deepened his kiss between her lips. You. Fong Ling could breathe normally. She pressed her hand against the man's chest, but her fingers gradually tightened. She did not push him away. The man's kiss gradually landed on her chin, gentle and affectionate. I thought you were going to sleep with me. Feng Ling blinked in the darkness. The lights in the bedroom were not turned on. Only the moonlight from the window fell in, but she could still see their eyes and faces clearly. Seeing that she did not move, the man used his uninjured arm to prop himself up and looked at her with deep eyes. I didn't want to kidnap you to the bed. You came up on your own. Tell me, if I let you go back at this time, how can I still be king man? Feng Ling looked at him for a long time and suddenly raised her hand to push him hard. The moment Li Nanheng thought he was going to push her away, she suddenly turned over and pushed him down on the bed with force. Then she pressed on him. The bed was very soft. Whether she lay down or he lay down, it was very comfortable. Li Nanheng stared at her because she suddenly changed from passive to active. He did not do anything to her next. He just looked at her and slowly asked, word by word, what do you want to do? Sleep with you, Feng Ling answered straightforwardly. She suddenly bent down and sucked on his lips. Li Nanheng lay motionless, allowing this woman who was still inexperienced in kissing to suck on his lips. Clearly, during the half a year in the jungle, he had patiently taught her how to kiss to make him feel better every night, but all her intelligence was used in the base. She could not learn these things well and was always clumsy when kissing. Just like now, in the business circle, she tried very hard to learn and adapt, but she was still not as good as when she learned those skills in the base. However, just this kiss that was so inexperienced that it almost hurt him, made the blood in the man's body boil. As Feng Ling kissed him hard, Li Nanheng felt that he should give her some encouragement. He raised his hand and placed it on the back of her head, pressing her head to prevent her from leaving. Just like this, their entanglement deepened. When Feng Ling's hand began to unbutton his shirt, the man gasped heavily because of her movements and gently bit her lips. Little vixen, if you want to do it, move faster. Do you want to kill me? Feng Ling unbuttoned his shirt as she kissed him. When the man's shirt was unbuttoned, she sighed against his lips as though she was relieved. Her hand stroked his well-defined and perfect chest, causing the man's muscles to tense as hard as stone. She imitated the way he usually kissed him and moved down bit by bit. She kissed his chin, then kissed his chin, and bit down bit by bit, kissed the man's protruding Adam's apple. Li Nanheng panted heavily and pressed his hand against her back, as though to prevent her from suddenly leaving. He held her tightly against him. Feng Ling could not get up, so she could only lie on his body and kiss him. When she suddenly sucked on the man's body, she suddenly heard the man's hoarse groan. Feng Ling blinked and could not help but kiss his lips again. Chapter 1341. After kissing for a while, Li Nanheng's shirt was forcefully pulled open by her. Her own clothes were slightly messy, and her long hair was entangled between their necks. Several times, many strands of hair stuck to his lips. The man seemed to be very patient as he kissed her hair inch by inch. Just as Feng Ling and the man kissed on the bed for a long time, Li Nanheng was ready to move. He couldn't wait for her to take off her clothes and reached out to pull down her pants. Feng Ling suddenly opened her misty eyes, pushed him away, and sat up straight on the bed. Caught off guard by her push, Li Nanheng really fell onto the bed. He raised his head abruptly and saw Feng Ling's expression as though she had just woken up from a dream. His heart skipped a beat. She woke up so quickly. No. She sat there and suddenly said 2 words. Looking at her serious expression, Li Nanheng sat up, his shirt unbuttoned, and a large part of his chest was exposed to the air. He looked at the woman with a strange expression. I'm still angry. I can't be like this with you. Fortunately, she didn't suddenly sober up. She just suddenly remembered that she couldn't go to bed so casually. Li Nanheng didn't know whether to cry or laugh. He lowered his head to look at the obvious changes in his pants that couldn't be concealed. I've already been seduced by you like this, and you suddenly say you're still angry? Feng Ling didn't look at him. As though she didn't hear him, she turned to get off the bed. Damn it, he was like this now, and she wanted to leave? How could Li Nanheng let her go so easily now? Out of habit, he raised his right hand to carry her back, but Feng Ling pushed him away as though she had been electrocuted. She used too much force and slapped the gauze on his arm. In an instant, Li Nanheng couldn't hold it in and groaned in pain. Suddenly hearing his painful groan, Feng Ling abruptly turned back to look at him. Seeing that he still cared about her, Li Nanheng held his arm and fell on the bed. As though he was in so much pain that he curled up on the bed and kept shouting, "Aya, it hurts, it hurts, it hurts, it hurts." Hearing him yelling in pain, Feng Ling's expression of, "I can't let him touch me again," gradually turned slightly worried. She hurriedly looked around, found the bedside lamp, and turned on the wall lamp in front of the bed. With the help of the light, she saw that the gauze on his arm seemed to be bleeding again. Startled by the blood, she rushed over to pull his hand. However, before she could touch his hand, the man retracted his hand and continued to hug his arm as he lay on the bed in pain. The worry in Feng Ling's eyes became even more obvious. She must have forgotten that the gauze on his arm was bandaged by her. After being drunk, her memory was so messed up that she didn't know how his hand was injured, but right now, she did look very worried. Li Nanheng called out for a while. When he turned to see her expression, he couldn't bear to see her like this. He simply sat up, gathered his shirt that she had just torn apart, and slowly covered the bloody gauze with the cuffs of his shirt. He looked at her. "Are you still leaving?" Feng Ling looked at him gloomily and then at his arm. She didn't dare to approach but was worried about his arm. "Why are you in a daze?" "I can't carry you now. Come over yourself." As he spoke, he pointed to the bed with his chin. "Sit down." Feng Ling glanced at him and sat down again. Li Nanheng calmed his emotions and glanced at the seat under his eyes. He sighed slightly and moved over to sit by her side. He lowered his eyes to look at her quiet appearance. "You suddenly remember that you're still angry, so you have to stay so far away from me? Aren't your principles a little too strong?" Feng Ling still did not speak but glanced at his arm from time to time. "Why? Does your heart ache?" he asked with a low chuckle. His voice was still a little husky, but because of his gentle tone, it also seemed to have a bewitching intent. "It's good that you're not at the base. Otherwise, you'll always be injured." She sat there, looking at his arm as if she didn't hear what he said. She just muttered to herself, "When you fight, you always use your arm to block. That's why other than the occasional gunshot wounds on your body, your arm is the one that gets hurt the most. There were a few times when your arm was almost crippled." Hearing her suddenly say this, Li Nanheng did not speak and only looked at her. "I still remember once when I was dressed in women's clothes in a bar, the gang that was about to be surrounded by us suddenly opened fire and almost injured me. You suddenly protected me. At that time, you were also grazed by a bullet here and bled a lot," she muttered. "But at that time, I was still a boy," she continued. Speaking of this matter, Li Nanheng smiled and sighed. "You still have the cheek to say that? I was turned gay by you, and then you forcibly turned straight by you." "Oh." Feng Ling looked at him again and then at the small tent under his pants. "What is bent? What is straight?" Li Nanheng, seeing her curious eyes, Li Nanheng pulled the quilt over his pants to avoid being stared at by her, and lectured her seriously, "You shouldn't have disguised yourself as a man to sneak into the base. If I had known that you were a little girl in the orphanage when you entered the base, perhaps I would have made an exception and accepted you. After all, your skills and agility are not bad. Rules are dead, but people are alive. I can change the rules, but you can't lie to others. Do you know that you've been disguised as a man in the base for so many years? Thousands of brothers have been deceived by you, and I have also been deceived by you for several years. Under your influence, everyone in the base lives like thousands of idiots. Are you very proud of yourself?" Li Nanheng's tone sounded harsh and reproachful. Feng Ling looked at him, then at his arm, and then at her own hand. It seemed that she suddenly realized where she got the courage to pretend to be a man in a place with so many men. Seeing her eyes, Li Nanheng lectured her with a serious expression. Do you remember how much you cheated in the base? Did I punish you? In the end, he still protected you. Have you ever thought about how bad it was for you to lie one after another? Hearing this, Feng Ling sat up straighter by the bed and lowered her head. Clearly, she knew she was wrong and was humbly accepting his advice. This woman had always been the one with a serious, cold face and disdain for everything. It was only after she drank that she could be so cute and obedient and let him bully her. Li Nanheng crossed his arms and still looked at her with a serious expression. In fact, he was almost injured from holding back his laughter. Begging for monthly votes. Chapter 1342. Li Nanheng really liked Feng Ling when she was drunk. The moment she got drunk, all the difficulties that Li Nanheng had faced over the years were swept away. It was as though they had found a place to vent the energy that they had not released before. He looked seriously at Feng Ling, who was humbly accepting his teachings, and pointed to his heart. I'm a man. I'm holding my heart in front of you, so sincere and so passionate. How do you treat me? Don't you know what you're doing? Feng Ling nodded. Did she mean that she knew what she was doing? If she really knew what she was doing, would she treat him like this? Li Nanheng glanced at her. Did you understand what I said just now? Feng Ling nodded, paused, and then shook her head. Li Nanheng, he knew it. Li Nanheng suddenly grabbed her hand domineeringly and pressed it against his chest. She blushed as though she was scalded and hurriedly pulled her hand away. He refused to let go and said in a low voice, I knew you were always like this. You can muddle through everything, but you can't do it with me. You stole my heart for 11 years and hurt it. You have to find a way to make it up to me. You can't just slip away. Anyway, you're mine, remember? Seeing Feng Ling nod again, Li Nanheng let go of her hand in satisfaction. Feng Ling looked at him and asked seriously, so, is it your heart that's hurt? Of course. Otherwise, can it be my stomach? Oh. Feng Ling looked at him and pointed at his heart. She suddenly raised her hand and searched around her body. In the end, she took out a small woman's wallet, took out a bank card from it, and handed it to Li Nanheng. Then I'll pay you. Li Nanheng, every time she got drunk, she would give bank cards everywhere. Who taught her this bad habit? Li Nanheng said, what I hurt is my heart. Why are you compensating me? Feng Ling insisted and stuffed the bank card into his arms. But I have nothing except this. Li Nanheng's heart seemed to be pierced by an arrow. After a pause, he picked up the card. It was actually a gold card with a credit limit of more than 5 million yuan. As expected of CEO Feng, he's so generous. As he spoke, he directly accepted the card, then raised his eyebrows and looked at her. Since you're so generous, I can't go against my conscience and accept this money. But if you insist, I'll accept it. However, I can promise to do 2 things for you. Tell me, what do you want to do the most right now? Unexpectedly, as soon as he finished speaking, Feng Ling suddenly reached out and snatched the gold card from his hand. No. Li Nanheng watched as she carefully put the card back into her wallet. What's wrong? Feng Ling looked aggrieved and embarrassed. She shook her head silently and put her wallet back into her pocket listlessly. She looked a little disappointed. Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows. Didn't you want to give me the card just now? Why aren't you giving it to me now? You know that I'm sad, and now you're not even bothered to give me this little material compensation? You're going to go all out, aren't you? Feng Ling glanced at him. I don't have enough money right now. This money is for the company's meals and salaries. Li Nanheng did not speak for a long time. He just looked at her and said after a moment, so? Didn't you ask how to appease my anger? How about this? I won't give you the money. If you help me do 2 things, I'll appease my anger. What is it? The first thing is to help me beat up Feng Mingyi. Feng Ling looked at him carefully. Li Nanheng understood that she wanted him to help her get rid of that troublesome brat. After all, her path in the business circle was not very smooth. With her current strength, it was indeed not easy to deal with TMing. However, she wanted to be strong. From the Feng Corporation's perspective, she could not show weakness. However, she did not have any external help. It was indeed difficult for her to rely on herself. "You've finally thought it through? I thought you were planning to fight with him and then come to me with your face covered in dirt. You should have come to me directly when you felt that something was wrong. Even if it was just a simple sentence, would have immediately stood up for you, loved you, and protected you. Why did you insist on acting tough until now? You couldn't sleep well for days and nights, and you only dared to show your weakness to me after drinking too much?" The man looked at her and his tone was indifferent. It was clear that he had finally heard what he wanted to hear. He was satisfied, but at the same time, he wanted to open her brain and see if her entire body was made of stone like her heart. As though not hearing his words, Feng Ling lowered her head and said, "There's one more thing." "Speak. Help me think of a way to raise 1 billion yuan. Li Nanheng raised his brows. "Oh? Didn't you want to bet with me? I can't beat you. I'll definitely lose." Feng Ling pinched her own fingers. Her tone sounded a little embarrassed. "Oh, so if you lose, you'll marry me." Feng Ling suddenly raised her eyes to look at him. After looking at him for a while, Feng Ling's face became redder and redder. Finally, she couldn't hold on any longer. She lowered her head in defeat and pinched her fingers as she said, "I promise I'll return that 1 billion yuan to you within 3 years. The important thing is when you'll marry me. It has nothing to do with that 1 billion yuan. You're my wife, and my net worth is all yours. I don't care if you want to return it for the rest of your life." The man stared at her little face. "After you lose, will you really marry me?" Feng Ling did not speak but glared at him. "Let me get that 1 billion yuan first." "Tisk, you're still talking about conditions when you're drunk." Li Nanheng said, "All right, let's not talk about marrying or not. I'll help you with the 1 billion yuan financing and helping you. Let's change the game. I'll ask and you'll answer. Don't hide anything." Unexpectedly, Feng Ling misunderstood his words. She suddenly said yes and then grabbed his uninjured arm. "Let's go out to play now." Li Nanheng said, "Let's go out to play now." Li Nanheng? Play? Play what? Seeing that she was in a hurry to go out and kept urging him to hurry up, Li Nanheng could only get up and button his shirt. He picked up 2 coats, put one on himself, and put the other on her. Then he was forcefully dragged out of the resort villa by Feng Ling. After arriving outside, Feng Ling bypassed the swimming pool, the hot spring, the gym, and all the normal entertainment facilities. On the way, she ran into the boss of a business partner. When he saw the 2 of them, he quickly greeted them. Before Li Nanheng could reply, he was dragged away by the drunk little Feng Ling. Chapter 1343. A certain CEO's hand froze in midair. What was going on? CEO Feng and CEO Li? There really was something going on. The 2 of them came out hand in hand in the middle of the night, and Feng Ling was holding Li Nanheng's hand? In the middle of the night? At this time? However, Feng Ling, who didn't like to be intimate with him in front of others, didn't seem to feel the strange gazes of others. She pulled him and continued running. Li Nanheng sighed with emotion at the intensity of her training back then. After a tiring day, she was still able to run so fast. As he was pulled, he asked, "Where are we going?" "We'll be out of the resort in a while. If you want to go out, go back to the parking lot. I'll drive you out." "What are you doing?" Feng Ling didn't say a word and continued to pull him. When they reached the children's entertainment area in the resort, she let go and walked in briskly. She ran to a slide and slid down like little Momo did in the hotel. Then she was as excited as a child and looked back at him with a smile. Let's play this. Li Nanheng, she ran out in the middle of the night just to play on a slide in the children's entertainment area. Feng Ling looked at him expectantly. Do you want to play? Li Nanheng. Can I just stand by the side and watch? Feng Ling had already walked over. She tugged on his uninjured arm and walked in. No, you have to play with me. Li Nanheng couldn't accept it, but he lowered his head to look at the little woman who was eagerly holding his hand. In a daze, he remembered that she had never seen these things in her childhood. She had never touched or seen anything that belonged to a child. Perhaps little Momo's happy play in the room had touched her heart, causing her to suddenly have a shallow obsession with her childhood that she had never had a good time. However, this obsession was not deep. Perhaps it was just a random thought. If she hadn't drunk too much, if he hadn't said to change the game, perhaps she would never have boldly dragged him to such a place. Feng Ling held him with one hand and climbed up a colorful circular frame with the other. Climb up from here, climb to the highest point, and then slide down from the slide on the side. Come with me. Li Nanheng was speechless. I'll pick you up from the slide. Are you going up by yourself? No. Do you really want me to go with you? All right. It seemed that if she didn't play with her once, she would regret it for the rest of her life. Seeing that she had already climbed up quickly, Li Nanheng shook his uninjured arm, grabbed the handrail with one arm, and climbed up layer by layer. Although these were all things for children to play with, fortunately, the space was not small and could squeeze 2 adults. It could also bear the weight of an adult. It was very safe. After climbing up, because he was climbing with one hand, it was definitely much more difficult than climbing with 2 hands. He could only climb up by relying on the stability of his lower body. He was already tired enough, but before he could catch his breath, he was pulled to the slide by the excited little woman and then slid down in front of him. Li Nanheng, I just climbed up. This time, Feng Ling ignored him. She played on the swing alone for a while, then went to sit on the wooden horse by the side for a while, and then walked around the other children's entertainment facilities for a long time. In the end, she returned to the slide and climbed up. She looked down to see that Li Nanheng was still sitting on it without moving, leisurely sitting on it like a parent accompanying his child. She glanced at him. You really don't want to play? Play what? Over there, the seesaw. I can't play by myself. She felt wronged. Li Nanheng glanced over there and then at her disappointed expression. He smiled and rubbed her head. All right, I'll play with you. Let me kiss you every time. Okay. She answered without hesitation. Li Nanheng smiled cunningly, pinched her chin, and kissed her hard on the lips. Then he looked at her dazed and moist eyes. This is my reward for accompanying you up here. Next, I'll kiss you every time. Remember it. Okay. She seemed to be calculating, then felt that it should be quite worth it, so she agreed. Li Nanheng immediately slid down happily. The 2 of them played with the seesaw, the little balance bike, the house, the sand, and all kinds of things that 2 adults could play at the same time in the children's entertainment area. In the end, Feng Ling was so happy that when she slid down the slide again, she sat in Li Nanheng's arms. The 2 of them slid down at the same time. When they landed, Li Nanheng was afraid that she would fall, so he hugged her tightly. She screamed excitedly in his arms and kept waving her hands. There was also the rocking car. Li Nanheng's figure definitely couldn't sit in such a small car. Feng Ling relied on her thin body and could actually sit in it. She threw in 2 hard coins and could ride for a while. She repeatedly begged Li Nanheng to help her change coins on the machine by the side. In the end, when the 2 of them came out of the children's entertainment area, their faces were covered in dust. Feng Ling ignored the sweat on her body and the dust on the entertainment facilities and pointed to the vending machine that could make ice cream with robots. I want to eat ice cream. All right. Li Nanheng agreed readily. He walked over and put the money in to buy one. He chose blueberry. After the ice cream was done, Feng Ling happily took it. She took 2 bites with a small spoon and frowned. She stuffed the ice cream cup into his hand. It's not delicious. Usually, this kind of machine-made ice cream did not taste as good as handmade ice cream. After all, it was repeatedly frozen and melted by the machine. However, for someone like Li Nanheng who didn't like sweets, the taste was no different. He took a bite with the spoon she had just used. It's not bad. It doesn't taste that bad. I won't eat it. You eat it, Feng Ling said. Li Nanheng didn't force her. After helping her eat a few bites, he dug out the blueberry jam inside and brought it to her mouth. Feng Ling glanced at it and ate the blueberry jam. In the end, when the ice cream cup was thrown away, she naughtily grabbed the cup, squeezed it into a cone, and threw it in the direction of the trash can. However, due to the wind and the fact that the cup was made of paper, it was blown to the side and landed on the grass. Li Nanheng sighed with a smile. He picked up the cup and threw it into the trash can. He turned back and said, "Don't throw things around." Chapter 1344. However, as soon as he said that, he saw a disappointed expression on her face. The paper cup definitely felt different from when she was on the shooting field and playing darts. It looked like it had lost its aim, and it really didn't make her happy. "I'll bring you back to the base when I have time. You can play with darts, guns, and sniper rifles. Forget about this kind of paper cup." The man touched her head and coaxed her softly. Feng Ling glanced at him. All right. From the sound of it, she was still not very happy. Clearly, she remembered that she was no longer familiar with the base, and there was a hint of complaint in her eyes. Li Nanheng couldn't help but hug her and touch the back of her head. All right, life can't be the same. Sooner or later, you have to leave. Just vent your anger on me. Don't be stifled by yourself. I want to go swimming. She didn't respond to his words. Instead, she suddenly said this in a muffled voice in his arms. Li Nanheng lowered his head to look at her. Didn't you already go in the afternoon? I didn't go into the water in the afternoon. I've been sitting by the side busy with work. Now I want to go swimming. Since she wanted to, he would accompany her. Li Nanheng brought her to the pool. In the end, Feng Ling probably felt that the night was a little cold, so she walked around the pool and went to the hot springs in front. It was not that the two of them had never soaked in a hot spring together before, but this was the first time she took the initiative to drag him to the hot spring in a daze after drinking too much. When the two of them walked over, she knew to go to the female guest changing area to change her clothes. When she changed into a swimsuit, she wrapped herself in a bath towel and entered the hot spring before putting the bath towel aside. Li Nanheng had long been waiting in the pool, but he saw that she did not come to the pool he was soaking in. Instead, she went to the one next to him, which happened to be 2 meters away from him. Feng Ling sat inside and lowered her head to play with the red rose petals floating on her side of the hot spring. She then observed the distance between her and Li Nanheng and seemed to be very satisfied with this distance. She nodded and seriously sat in the hot spring and closed her eyes. Li Nanheng was about to go over. Even though Feng Ling had her eyes closed, when she heard the sound of water, she suddenly said, "Don't come over." Li Nanheng. He was a patient with an injured arm, and he had to be careful not to touch the water while soaking in the hot spring. He had worked so hard to accompany her out for so long, but they were not allowed to soak in the same hot spring pool. What was going on? Seeing that Feng Ling was about to fall asleep, Li Nanheng said to himself, "The taboo of soaking in a hot spring is sleeping. Do you want to die?" After saying that, he felt that he would definitely have a good reason to go there now, so he got up and went to the hot spring. When he entered the water, Feng Ling almost fell asleep. She abruptly woke up and opened her eyes to see that the man had approached. She had almost fallen asleep earlier, and now her eyes were slightly dazed as she stared at him. The man approached and pulled her into his arms. He sat her on his lap and let her soak in the hot spring in his arms. Don't sleep. It's easy for something to happen if you sleep in the hot spring. It's not good for your health. Fong Ling glanced at him and rested her head on his shoulder. Li Nanheng's entire body stiffened because of her sudden obedience. He lowered his eyes to look at the little woman who was obediently sitting in his arms. She was wearing a new white swimsuit specially provided for the female guests. It was not considered revealing, but it was not particularly conservative either. It was a very standard style, but when she wore it, it made her originally fair skin even fairer. Her cheeks were pink from the faint alcohol and from soaking in the hot spring for a long time. He deliberately got her drunk and spent so much time and effort. His original goal was to listen to what she had been saying all these years. Now that he had achieved his goal, he had kissed her and hugged her. He didn't have to take her. As long as he was sure that she didn't have any other reason other than being angry, he could solve all the problems and patiently wait for the day she took the initiative and was willing to do it. However, at this moment, Li Nanheng found that no matter what reason he found, he could not deceive himself. He wanted her. He wanted her all the time. He didn't want to just hug her here. He didn't want to just watch her sleep. He wanted to sleep with her. Fong Ling was originally sitting in his arms. Suddenly, she opened her eyes as though she was uncomfortable and looked at him in a daze. Only then did Li Nanheng realize that as he hugged her, his hand was tightly gripping her waist. He did not change his position for a long time. He probably pinched her waist bone. She glanced at him unhappily. He quickly retracted his hand and simply hugged her. Did I hurt you? Her waist hurt from his grip, but Fong Ling did not say anything. She just shook her head and continued to sit in his arms, looking quiet and obedient. Li Nanheng's heart skipped a beat. He raised his hand and hooked his finger to touch her chin. But after touching it twice, Fong Ling suddenly turned her head and looked at him again. Her eyes were a little cold. Don't touch me. Her fair face still had a tinge of redness, and her long and curled eyelashes had transparent water droplets on them. Her expression looked much colder than when she was in the children's entertainment area, but her eyes were still hazy. She told him not to touch her. Now that she was in his arms, who could stand it? Besides, he had been playing with her outside for so long in the middle of the night. Couldn't she let him have a taste of this little cookie? It was likely that the alcohol content of the 2 bottles of wine tonight was really not low, and the after effect was not light either. Li Nanheng's head was a little hot from being soaked in the hot spring. In addition, Fong Ling's cold expression seemed to be when she was awake. Her gaze and this scene made the desire in the depths of his heart churn, overwhelming all his concerns and concessions. He kissed the sensitive spot under her ear and chuckled hoarsely. You dragged me out and dragged me to the hot spring. You're dressed like this and sitting in my arms like this. You still won't let me touch you? Your methods of torturing people are getting better and better, En? Fong Ling glared at him, and there seemed to be some chagrin and awkwardness in her eyes. Before she could move away from his arms, the man could no longer hold it in. As though he had gone mad, he pressed the back of her head and kissed her harshly. Li Nanheng's kiss was too fierce and heavy. One of Fong Ling's hands was still in the water. She subconsciously tried to hold on to something, but the man firmly held her waist. The only thing she could hold on to was his leg. However, as soon as she reached down, she was scalded and abruptly retracted her hand. The man grunted and almost rubbed her into his bones. Dash, begging for monthly votes, ha ha ha. Chapter 1345. Fong Ling seemed to be angered by Li Nanheng's fierce kiss. She suddenly raised her hand and pulled hard on his neck. Li Nanheng only felt a strong force that belonged to her when she was at the peak of the base, and he was involuntarily dragged into the water by Fong Ling. Except for an injured arm that was still supporting on the edge of the pool, his entire body, including his head, was also in the water. The water splashed everywhere and was out of control. He didn't know if he started first or if she suddenly started first, but when Li Nanheng popped his head out of the water, Feng Ling also came out of the water with him. Her two slender arms tightly wrapped around his neck, holding him, and her lips and teeth were entangled with his for a long time. The two of them were tightly pressed together. Both of them were clearly wet, but Li Nanheng's mind was full of dry firewood and raging fire. He only maintained his sobriety for a few seconds. There was a faint voice in his heart telling him that if he really took advantage of Feng Ling being drunk and unable to distinguish right from wrong, she would definitely be angry afterward. However, as Feng Ling suddenly took the initiative, this voice gradually disappeared in his mind. Li Nanheng ignored his injured arm and directly hugged her tightly in the water. Even though the gauze was soaked in water, he didn't feel any pain and kissed her inseparably. He had long forgotten his inner promise and thoughts of, she drank too much and I was just coaxing her, I was just playing with her, and, if she was unwilling tonight, there was no need to take the last step. Suddenly, Li Nanheng snorted, parted his lips, and cursed in a low voice, "You're so drunk and yet you still bite me? Weren't you quite gentle when you were lying on me in the room just now? Why did you bite so hard?" Hearing Li Nanheng's words, Feng Ling didn't say a word but bit his chin again. Li Nanheng instantly shivered in pain, but he also shivered in pleasure. He frowned slightly and held her tightly in his arms. As if taking revenge, he reached into the water and rubbed her sensitive parts hard. Because of a movement of his hand underwater, Feng Ling's expression suddenly changed. Li Nanheng chuckled, took a few breaths, and kissed her red and wet lips. "How is it? How do you feel?" He tugged the necklace from the back of her neck and dragged her into the water the moment her swimsuit slid down to prevent her from getting cold. His tone was filled with the excitement of knowing that no matter what he did to her, she wouldn't get angry. "You've taken the initiative twice tonight. When you suddenly stopped in the room just now, I almost choked half to death. If you dare to back away now, even if I have to force myself on you, I'll make sure you stay here. You won't be able to escape, do you understand?" The man held her waist firmly with one hand and the edge of the pool with the other. Their bodies were so hot that it was as if they were about to catch fire. The edge of the pool was already a mess because of the water splashing everywhere. Feng Ling still didn't speak. When she reached the edge, she almost used all her strength to grab the man in front of her. Li Nanheng paused. Before he could understand what she was going to do, he was suddenly pressed against the edge of the pool by Feng Ling. Half of his body was still in the water, but Feng Ling was very fierce. She was completely different from her usual cold and indifferent self when she was sober, nor was she as cute and adorable as she was when she was drunk. Li Nanheng's back hurt from the impact, but it only turned into a sexy grunt. He lowered his eyes to look at the woman in his arms who was suddenly as fierce as a little leopard. He lowered his head and said hoarsely by her ear, "What? You're coming tonight? You don't allow me to take the initiative? Do you want to move by yourself?" The earlobe by his lips was as white as jade. When Li Nanheng finished speaking, he couldn't help but bite her ear. After biting it, he gently sucked and kissed it. Feng Ling's fingers that were holding his shoulder instantly tightened. Her slightly long nails seemed to be about to dig into the skin of his shoulder. At the same time, she put down her hand and reached for the black swimming trunks he was wearing when he soaked in the hot spring. Li Nanheng curved his lips and lowered his head to steal another kiss on her cheek. He panted and said, "So impatient?" With that, he reached into the water and pressed her hand against his waist. "There's no need for you to take it off. I'll do it myself." After speaking, he directly took it off himself. The swimsuit on Feng Ling's body had long fallen off. Right now, the two of them were naked. Their bodies were pressed against each other, and their skin was rubbing against each other. They hugged and kissed each other intimately. Li Nanheng's left hand pressed against the back of Feng Ling's neck, not allowing her to separate, not even the slightest gap. However, Feng Ling's kiss was inexplicably close to biting. She placed her hand on his back and touched the old wounds on his back. Her movements gradually became gentle as she gently caressed them. However, Li Nanheng's hand was very impolite. As he kissed, he had already wandered around her body several times. In the end, he greedily stopped at her waist and slowly moved down, rubbing back and forth. Although it was late at night, there would be people passing by at any time. It was also possible that someone couldn't sleep and would come to soak in the hot spring or swim. However, Li Nanheng knew that if he stopped at this time, the cold wind would give Feng Ling a chance to wake up. He would probably suffocate to death here. His movements became more and more unbridled, and the kiss gradually changed from her lips to her chin, and then down bit by bit, passing through her slender neck, beautiful collarbone, and then down. Their ears were filled with each other's uncontrollable breathing. Li Nanheng had already endured to the point where the veins on his forehead were throbbing, but he couldn't. Although he would really explode from suffocation if he didn't do it, the hot spring water was not sanitary, so he simply grabbed her hand underwater and helped him solve it. The moment she obediently allowed him to pull her over, Li Nanheng felt all the blood in his body rush to a certain place. As his scalp went numb, the man's throat overflowed with a faint voice. Gently, gently. Feng Ling, why are you so heavy-handed today? At a certain moment, Li Nanheng's mind went blank. After a long while, he hugged the woman in his arms tightly again, bent down to kiss her fiercely, and then turned back to wrap the two of them in a bath towel. He quickly walked back along the road that led directly to the dormitory area from the pool. Feng Ling allowed him to wrap her in the bath towel and let him carry her away without struggling. When she tilted her head, his kiss fell again. He couldn't separate, couldn't pause, and couldn't let her escape again. The passionate kiss continued until they returned to the room. Li Nanheng kicked the door open and carried her in. After entering the door, he carried her into the bathroom of the suite without hesitation and returned to the bed that had been tossed into a mess. He threw her onto the bed and pressed her down mercilessly. Chapter 1346. This was such an exciting night. How they gave each other, satisfied each other, and demanded from each other until they were exhausted. By the second half of the night, even Li Nanheng could barely remember. Tonight, the little woman was as enchanting as fire on his body. She took the initiative to make him wonder if she was only like this when she was drunk. However, he couldn't spare the effort to think about it. He was pestered by her again and again until he wished he could die on her. The night passed quickly. The wound on Li Nanheng's arm was slightly infected and inflamed in the hot spring pool. He didn't take care of this arm all night. In the early morning, his body temperature was slightly high. Feng Ling was woken up by the rising temperature of the man's body. She abruptly opened her eyes and felt that the man's injured and inflamed arm was still holding her firmly. She slowly sat up, slowly pushed his hand away, turned her eyes, and looked at him calmly for a while before looking at the condition of his arm. Last night, when the two of them were rolling on the bed, he felt that the wet gauze was a hindrance, so he took it off and threw it away. Although the bleeding had stopped, the wound was obviously white and swollen. She felt that it was probably a fever caused by the heat from the wound. She had already sat up, but he still hadn't woken up. It was obvious that his fever wasn't light. She gently got off the bed, turned around, and brought in the gauze and disinfectant that she hadn't used last night. She then returned to the bed and gently treated his wound. She disinfected the infected area for a while longer. Li Nanheng frowned in his sleep because of the stinging pain on his arm. Several times when he was about to wake up, Feng Ling pressed her hand to his eyes, stroked his eyebrows, and said softly, "Continue sleeping." If he woke up, she wouldn't be able to continue sitting here calmly and helping him apply medicine. As expected, the man continued to fall asleep because of her temperature and voice. She slowly retracted her hand and continued to apply medicine. After repeating this for almost half an hour, she finally treated his wound and slowly wrapped it with gauze. When everything was done, the sky outside was already bright. It was probably past 6 in the morning. Feng Ling got up and found a bathrobe in the closet in the room. To put it on. After all, in this kind of resort, people often wore bathrobes to eat breakfast in the morning, so this kind of appearance wouldn't arouse anyone's suspicion. When she went out, she happened to meet Yu Zheng, who had just come up from the room downstairs. Others didn't know what was going on, but Yu Zheng knew which clothes Feng Ling had worn yesterday. She had stayed in CEO Li's room for an entire night and had only left now. She had changed into a bathrobe. Feng Ling did not say much. She only nodded politely at Yu Zheng and walked out. When she passed by him, she said, "The wound on your CEO Li's arm is infected and inflamed. I've treated his wound, but I'm definitely not as professional as a professional. He has a fever. Keep an eye on his condition. If he doesn't feel, let him take some medicine." Yu Zheng was stunned. Miss Feng Ling did not speak anymore and walked out, leaving Yu Zheng standing there in a daze. Hadn't she already treated his wound last night? Why did it suddenly become infected and inflamed to the point of having a fever? When Feng Ling returned to her room, Qin Shuk had just woken up. She sat lazily on the sofa and glanced at Feng Ling's outfit. She snorted. "I knew you didn't come back last night. Something good must have happened." Sure enough, Li Nanheng is more skilled. As long as he meets you, he can definitely settle you. He could settle her? With wine? Feng Ling was too lazy to explain. She took a shower and changed her clothes. Qin Shuk was still lying on the sofa. She said lazily, "I soaked in the hot spring yesterday and felt weak all over. After sleeping, I still feel sleepy. Help me bring breakfast back to eat." "I don't want to go out to eat." "I don't want to eat either." "Call someone to bring it over." Feng Ling sat on the sofa and brought the computer over. She placed it on her lap and turned on the computer to work. Qin Shuk simply jumped forward and rested her head on her lap. At the same time, she picked up a pillow next to her and hugged it in her arms. She rested it on her lap with a very comfortable expression and said, "I say, are you really not going to tell me what happened last night? I didn't see you when I came back. You didn't come back for the whole night. If I didn't know you had some martial arts, I'm afraid ordinary people wouldn't have the ability to kidnap you. I'm afraid I would have called the police to come to the resort to find you." Feng Ling stared at the computer screen. "We probably won't be able to attend the financing conference in Washington. After all, the Feng Corporation's current situation is strained. This is something that many partners can see. Especially a few days ago, the stock price fell due to certain circumstances. Now, it has risen and fallen. We should return to New York as soon as possible to stabilize the situation. As for this side, I was originally determined to get that financing, but based on the current situation, I can only let go. Otherwise, the company will be hurt and we won't get any benefits." Hearing that she had changed the topic, Qin Shuk wanted to say something, but what Feng Ling said was indeed an important choice. She sat up with the pillow in her arms, crossed her legs, and leaned against the sofa. She turned to look at Feng Ling, "But this 1 billion yuan is too important to the Feng Corporation. We've been out for so many days. If we don't bring back a single cent, the old people in the company who don't know the truth will only say that you're incompetent. They don't know what's going on, but you know their mouths." "I know." Feng Ling placed her hand on the keyboard and said indifferently as she typed, "It's not that I can't get a single cent back, but 1 billion yuan is very difficult. I have to think of another way. As for TMing, I plan to solve it before returning to New York. We can talk about other things later." "What do you want to do about TMing?" "I have my ways, but it might be a little risky." Feng Ling's tone was still indifferent. Qin Shuk looked at her for a while and suddenly reached out to tug at Feng Ling's collar. When she saw the ambiguous kiss marks on her neck and collarbone, she immediately sucked in a breath of cold air. "Oh my God, he's too heavy-handed. Yesterday, your body was fine, but now your neck and shoulders, oh my God." Feng Ling's face instantly turned red. She quickly pushed her away and adjusted her clothes. She turned to glare at her. "Why did you lift my clothes?" Chapter 1347. I'm just curious about your battle last night. Qin Shuk held back her laughter and blushed. After all, although she was very bold, she had never met a man who could make her willingly sleep with him. She had always only dared to watch and speak. She had never dared to do anything. I didn't expect it. She smiled. It seems like Li Nanheng really had a good time last night. Have you been enlightened? Have you remembered who the boss is? I knew it. You shouldn't keep holding back your bad temper. When it's time to show weakness to him, you should show weakness. This way, perhaps CEO Li can. Feng Ling closed the computer and turned to leave, no longer listening to her nonsense. She had drunk too much last night. Later in the hot spring, perhaps because the water was too hot, the alcohol concentration in her body had dropped significantly, causing her to be half awake. But perhaps it was because of the environment, the scene, the lingering alcohol in her body, the tenderness in the man's eyes. Because of various reasons, even though she was clearly sober, she couldn't help herself. She didn't want to think about it anymore. There were only 2 days in the resort. The first day passed just like that. The next morning, Li Nanheng's fever had not subsided. He was resting in his room and she didn't see him for the entire morning. After the afternoon, Feng Ling sat in the dessert house in the resort, eating dessert with Qin Shuk while talking about work with a certain boss. Of course, the other party wouldn't give her any financing. They were only talking about some simple cooperation cases. Thankfully, the conversation was very pleasant. Although the company behind this husband wasn't very strong and couldn't help much in terms of financing, he could at least add tens of millions of yuan to the phone corporation. This could be considered as temporarily solving the company's urgent problem. The current situation in the company was not as good as it seemed. The only liquid funds could only maintain the salary of all the employees for a month and the money to maintain some things on the surface. There was really not a single cent left. These tens of millions were like rain after a long drought. It was really not easy. They chatted happily. After the boss left, Feng Ling finally revealed a sincere smile. Qin Shuk ate a small cake with her and worked together. The afternoon passed quickly. At night, most of the people in the resort had to catch an early flight tomorrow to go abroad for business, so they wouldn't stay here tonight. Feng Ling was the same. Before leaving, when she went to the parking lot, she finally saw Li Nanheng. His fever should have gone down. He was dressed in a suit and looked very energetic. He was very different from the man with an arm injury last night. Feng Ling just looked at him silently in the parking lot and then entered her car as if nothing had happened. Qin Shuk thought she would say something to Li Nanheng, but unexpectedly, there was nothing, so she also entered the car. Seeing Feng Ling's expression, she didn't look shy or angry, and she didn't know what she was thinking. Yu Zheng, on the other hand, stood by the side and looked at the car door that had already been closed. He then looked at the man in front of him. CEO Li, Miss Feng, and we should be going the same way. Should we call them over for a ride? No need. Although Li Nanheng did not say much, his gaze toward Feng Ling's car deepened. After leaving the resort, nothing happened for 3 or 4 days. Feng Ling and Li Nanheng seemed to have a tacit understanding that they didn't even send each other a call or a text message. It was as though what happened that night was really just an erotic dream she couldn't remember after getting drunk. However, whether she was awake or drunk at that time, she knew, and he knew. In the last few days in Washington, Feng Ling was busy talking about cooperation every day. After running into a wall several times, she managed to negotiate 2 deals in a financing case, but the total revenue from all the deals and financing was only 300 million yuan. It wasn't enough to fill the gaps between her teeth. It could only be said that it could alleviate a small part of the urgent need. As for TMing, she had already made preparations. Back then, she had also gambled with Feng Mingi, but this so-called gamble covered many aspects, not just the 1 billion yuan of financing. Just as Feng Ling was about to go to TMing again and meet Feng Mingi, a piece of news suddenly exploded in the financial world of Washington. The head of Tianming, Feng Mingyi, was arrested by the Washington police for a murder 3 years ago. Tianming was also suspected of a major financial case of money laundering 2 years ago. Looking at the news, Feng Ling sat in front of the computer and did not move for a long time. Qin Shuk also stood by the side and looked at the news on the screen. Then she lowered her head and turned on her phone to look at it for a while. She was sure that the news was true, and this news had quickly covered the entire Chinese business circle in the United States. Almost in an instant, it was in everyone's sight. This is God helping you? Qin Shuk said in shock. Feng Mingyi doesn't look like a good person, but he was actually involved in a murder case and was even involved in a money laundering case. Now that this kind of thing is exposed, I'm afraid he's completely finished, right? Who is this? At such a critical moment, he suddenly knocked him down. There's no need for you to do anything. At this moment, Feng Ling couldn't help but wonder if she had said something after she drank too much at Li Nanheng's place that day. These were all evidence and information that she had already collected, but she hadn't found a chance to expose it. Furthermore, it wasn't as complete as the other parties. If she wanted to obtain so much evidence, it would probably take at least a few months. However, it was clear that someone had really helped her get rid of Feng Mingyi. She had never remembered clearly what happened after she was drunk, but she couldn't have said anything, could it be? Qin Shuk suddenly shifted her gaze to Feng Ling. Li, go check on Tianming's current stock and internal situation. After all, there's something wrong with the person in charge of Tianming. The internal liquidity has probably been stopped. See if they have any other way out. If not, it means that the Feng Corporation will take back Tianming. Feng Ling didn't say much about this. She just struck while the iron was hot. Feng Mingyi doesn't need us to care about him now, but we can't give up Tianming. This is an industry that my father released back then. We have to take it back now. Qin Shuk glanced at her. All right, I'll go check. Then she suddenly paused. By the way, if they still have clean funds, this sum of funds might be able to fill our current peacock. Killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Wonderful. Chapter 1348. Qin Shuk was right. Even if Tianming was involved in money laundering, it must have been because of 2 years ago. Putting aside what he did back then, Tianming had been showing off in the financial world for the past 2 years. There should be a lot of clean money in his liquid funds. Even if he didn't have 1 billion yuan, he should still have 300 to 400 million yuan. After Qin Shuk left, Feng Ling looked at the information on the computer for a while. She stood up and walked to the huge window behind her. She looked at the tallest financial building on the street in Washington and at the silver top. Since Feng Mingyi had done such a shady business, he must have been very careful in his actions. Furthermore, his relationships with various parties were very strong. If the person behind him did not have a certain amount of power, it would definitely not have been so clean and neat to expose his affairs. Feng Mingyi did not even have a chance to catch his breath and walked onto the path of death. In fact, she hadn't even participated in any disputes. She didn't even have the chance to participate in a fight. This matter had indeed solved her urgent problem, but the only person she could think of who could do this was Li Nanheng. The current situation of the Feng Corporation was not as optimistic as it seemed on the surface. However, in order to control the overall situation, she couldn't show everyone her current tense side. She had been enduring and thinking of ways to support the Feng Corporation, but many people in the circle had sharp eyes. Even if they didn't say it, they understood the situation of the Feng Corporation, so they definitely wouldn't easily help. After all, there were no benefits for them. Indeed, other than Li Nanheng who could help her without asking for the result, there was no one else who could be so willing to help her. However, she had never mentioned the Feng Corporation's situation, but Li Nanheng knew what her first step was. Before she made a move, he helped her cut off the other party's path of attack. Feng Ling stood by the window and watched for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Li Nanheng. No one picked up the phone for a long time. She called again, but no one picked up. She found his current assistant, Yu Zheng's number in the address book. This time, it went through. Hello, Miss Feng. Assistant Yu, is CEO Li here? CEO Li is not in Washington right now. Miss Feng, you can call his private number. I just called, but he didn't pick up. I'm not too sure about that. CEO Li has been quite busy since returning from the vacation. He occasionally deals with the company's matters and occasionally discusses something with Brother Su. However, when he and Brother Su are discussing things, I'm basically not around. Yu Zheng said respectfully. CEO Li didn't say anything before he left this time. He only said that he had something to do and returned to Los Angeles. Fortunately, our vice president was transferred over. As long as the person in charge appears, we can participate in the financial conference normally. Xiao Su had been by Li Nanheng's side, which Feng Ling knew very well. It was true that apart from the company work, Yu Zheng had no access to Li Nanheng's past life and the people around him, nor would he know anything other than his working hours. Feng Ling thanked him and hung up the phone. Right now, she was 90% sure that Li Nanheng was the one behind TMing, but he suddenly returned to Los Angeles in a hurry. She didn't know what happened, but after all, 11 Base and the Li Corporation were both in Los Angeles, so she couldn't make wild guesses. She did not call Li Nanheng again. She stood in front of the window and watched silently for a while before picking up her phone again to call Feng Mingyi. Feng Mingyi had been arrested, but he was still a suspect and had not been officially sentenced. Under the surveillance of the police, he could still answer calls normally. The next day, Feng Ling went to TMing. When the staff of TMing saw that it was the current CEO of the Feng Corporation, none of them dared to speak loudly, but they still whispered in a corner that they thought no one else could see. After all, many of the old employees who came out with TMing knew the relationship between TMing and the Feng Corporation. Now that something had happened to Feng Mingyi and TMing had been put on hold because of money laundering, if the Feng Corporation did not take over, all the employees in the company would face the disaster of losing a month's salary and losing their jobs. If the Feng Corporation took over, the old employees who had followed Feng Mingyi out would definitely not have a good time. All the employees of TMing had their own plans, but they didn't know how this young female CEO of the Feng Corporation wanted to treat them. However, to their surprise, Feng Ling only brought people over to check all the company's accounts and all the recent large expenditure channels and large income channels. After sorting out the liquid funds that the company could still use freely, she only held an afternoon meeting with several executives in the finance department and did not say anything to the HR department. After the meeting with the finance department, Feng Ling actually left. She still didn't go to the HR department to talk about the layoffs or the changes in TMing's personnel. However, everyone was still on tenterhooks. They didn't know if they would face unemployment, and with the current situation, it was very likely that the entire company wouldn't receive a salary. All the employees of TMing were depressed for 2 days. It wasn't until the Feng Corporation issued an official recall letter to TMing that the proper arrangements for all the employees of TMing were sent to the company that all the employees heaved a sigh of relief. She actually had no intention of firing them. Although Feng Ling planned to take TMing back to the Feng Corporation, she planned to only be a subsidiary company of the Feng Corporation. She wouldn't completely bring it back to the headquarters. At the same time, she would let these old employees in TMing enjoy all the normal treatment they had in the past. She wouldn't let any of them leave, but she had to let every employee pass the ability test and quality test again. If they all passed, none of them would be laid off. If there were people who didn't pass the test and were in the company would make other arrangements for them. Very fair. Furthermore, Feng Mingyi's downfall did not affect the lives and work of the employees in TMing. This allowed Feng Ling to establish a more amiable image in the entire company. It proved that she was not a tyrannical and harsh manager and was very popular. Ever since Feng Mingyi's accident, the work of reorganizing TMing finally stabilized after 2 or 3 days. Fong Ling finally found the time to call Li Nanheng. However, this time, no one picked up for a long time. The other party had no signal and was not in the service area. Chapter 1349. At night. Fong Ling had been busy all day and had just fallen asleep when her phone suddenly vibrated by her pillow. She abruptly opened her eyes, picked up her phone, and sat up. "Miss Fong, I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but little Momo suddenly has a high fever. CEO Li isn't here right now. We have to send Momo to the hospital, but it's not easy for us to make the decision. We can only inform you first." It was a call from her assistant, Yu Zheng. When Fong Ling heard that little Momo was sick, she immediately woke up. Why did he suddenly have a high fever? I'm not sure yet. CEO Li hired 2 very reliable aunties to take care of him here, but yesterday, Auntie brought little Momo to the nearby children's amusement park to play. I don't know if it's because there are too many children there or if there's any flu virus. Although he washed his hands after coming back, I heard that it's the peak period for children to catch a cold. Little Momo's fever hasn't subsided since 4 in the afternoon. I understand. Send him to the hospital first. I'll be there soon. All right, I'll send you the hospital's location later. After hanging up the phone, Fong Ling quickly got up to change her clothes. Because she had just fallen asleep and suddenly woke up, her head hurt a little. She washed her face with cold water and went out. She drove all the way to the hotel where little Momo was staying. Along the way, she received the hospital's location from Yu Zheng. It was near the hotel. She stepped on the accelerator and sped up. When they arrived at the hospital, little Momo had already been injected with a muscle injection to reduce his fever. Because the injection was too painful, he was crying in Yu Zheng's arms. Fong Ling went over and called out, "Momo." Hearing her voice, little Momo turned back aggrievedly and stretched out his arms for her to carry. There were still tears on the little guy's face. His face was red from the fever. Fong Ling hurriedly took him and held him in her arms. As she coaxed and patted his back, she looked around. There were many parents holding their children, and most of them seemed to have a high fever. "How is it? Did you find out the reason?" Fong Ling asked as she patted little Momo, who was sobbing in her arms. Yu Zheng nodded. "It's nothing. It's just a cold. The source of infection is probably in the amusement park. There are too many children there, and many of them are coughing." Auntie saw that little Momo was too bored and wanted to go out to play with him, but she didn't expect him to catch a cold. Fortunately, the doctor said that under normal circumstances, after the fever subsides tomorrow morning, it'll be fine. "I'm really sorry for troubling you so late. What's there to be embarrassed about? I entrusted little Momo to you to take care of. He's sick now, so I should come no matter how late it is." As Fong Ling spoke, she kissed little Momo's little face with heartache. Feeling that his face was indeed hot, she couldn't help but ask, "Won't it be a problem if it keeps burning?" Momo 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 Mother Momo Momo ill and Mother, up. Fong Ling had never taken care of a child before, and this was the first time she had encountered such a sick child. Thankfully, Yu Zheng's words were clear and simple, which put her at ease. "Momo, be good. Auntie will accompany you in the hospital tonight, okay?" Fong Ling kissed the little guy's face again. Little Momo did not speak. He hugged her neck and cried aggrievedly. From time to time, he would reach out to touch his own butt. It seemed like the injection was really painful. Fong Ling touched his little butt, lowered her head, and whispered in his ear, "Does it hurt?" Little Momo choked up again. He sniffled in her arms and said, "Momo, it hurts, little pitiful." Fong Ling touched him again, her heart aching. She turned back and asked a few more questions. After confirming that she could carry little Momo to a resting room near the emergency room or a quiet ward for the child to rest, she carried Momo upstairs to find a ward. Originally, she wanted to put little Momo on the bed, but he refused to let go. He even hugged her neck tightly and sobbed. Fong Ling couldn't bear to see him like this. She simply hugged him and coaxed him. At the same time, she instructed Yuzheng to buy food for little Momo. He had just been injected with a fever, so there were many things that he couldn't eat randomly. Yuzheng went out for a long time before he bought something edible. He also bought a lot of toys that little boys liked, such as cars, planes, and so on. Little Momo's eyes lit up when he saw the toys, but he couldn't bear to leave Fong Ling's embrace. He struggled for a long time until Fong Ling said, "Momo, sit here and play with the toys. Auntie won't leave. Auntie won't be so busy recently. I can have a lot of time to accompany you, okay?" The little guy finally let go and turned to focus on playing with the toys. Seeing that he was so sensible, he only cried when the injection hurt. After that, it no longer hurt, and he didn't cry because he was sick. Other than asking adults to hug him, he only played with his toys. He was really a very obedient little baby. Fong Ling supported her chin with one hand and sat on the chair by the bed. She leaned against the table by the bed and looked at little Momo, who looked up at her blankly for help because he couldn't understand the new toy. It was a transformer toy. It seemed like its limbs could be removed to turn into a small car, but after removing it, it was a little difficult to restore it. Fong Ling had never played with it before and didn't know much about it. However, looking at the little guy's pleading expression, she couldn't help but reach over to play with him. In the end, after spending more than an hour, she still couldn't recover an arm or leg. In the end, even the appearance of the car changed. Yuzheng went out to bring back little Momo's blood test results. As soon as he entered the door, he saw Fong Ling, who was usually cold and aloof, leaning against the bed and playing with the transformer with little Momo. Most importantly, both of them looked helpless. Yuzheng smiled and walked over to put down the blood test results. He went forward to help. As expected, it was easy for men to play with such toys. In a few moments, he was done. Little Momo jumped around on the bed excitedly and kept shouting that Uncle Yu was awesome. Fong Ling was infected by this atmosphere and suddenly felt that children were so cute and naive. No matter how uncomfortable they were, no matter how painful the injection was, as long as a toy was installed, they would be so happy as though they had the whole world. Little Momo's test results were indeed as the doctor had said. It was indeed a viral cold. There was not a big problem. Fong Ling was relieved and got up to find the bathroom. After all, she had stayed up all night and was a little sleepy. She wanted to wash her face with cold water. Chapter 1350. As soon as she walked out of the bathroom, she suddenly heard the heart-wrenching cries of adults coming from the pediatric emergency room in the distance. Fong Ling felt that something seemed to have happened there. She didn't have the habit of meddling in other people's business, but most of the children in this kind of pediatric emergency room were children, so she subconsciously walked over. A little boy about 1 year old with a pale face was pushed in on the bed. Next to him, he should be the child's parents. He kept crying and shouting. He seemed to be a native of Washington and spoke American English. Hearing the conversation of the medical staff from afar, she learned that the child accidentally swallowed a small coin and it was stuck in his throat. Seeing that the child's snow-white skin had been choked to purple and listening to the adult's cries, Fong Ling frowned and inexplicably panicked in her heart. Such a small child. Suddenly, a figure walked quickly from the back of the crowd and quickly picked up the child from the bed that was being pushed. Then, he turned the child around and made the child lie on his stomach. Nurses rushed over from all directions. After all, the doctors in the emergency room were so busy that they could not separate themselves from receiving patients. When they suddenly saw such a person suddenly coming over and using such a professional first aid technique, they were all stunned. When Fong Ling approached and saw the tall man, her expression did not change, but a trace of hesitation flashed across her brows. Dr. Wen? Wen Linhan was not wearing a white coat but a simple shirt and trousers. He had many private hospitals under his name. He definitely wouldn't work in this hospital in Washington, and judging from his clothes, he shouldn't be a doctor here. However, his technique was professional and fast. Before anyone could react, his hand had already patted the child's back. In less than a minute, the child suddenly began to vomit with great difficulty. Then, with a forceful movement of crying and vomiting, the coin that almost took his life suddenly fell out of his mouth. Although the coin finally came out, the child's face had turned blue and he was still very weak. Wen Linhan didn't say much. He got up and put the child back on the bed. With a few simple words, he signaled the nurse to quickly push the child into the emergency room. The children's families were also stunned. After thanking him, they hurriedly followed him into the emergency room. Wen Linhan didn't say much but glanced over there. When he turned around, he suddenly paused, turned his eyes, and met Feng Ling's eyes. When Feng Ling came back to herself, Wen Linhan was already looking at her. Obviously, he was quite surprised that she was here. However, this expressionless man only watched her for a moment before walking over. Feng Ling? Dr. Wen. Feng Ling remembered that before when Liqing left, she had told her not to let anyone find little Momo. From the child's expression and appearance, she could tell that Momo was Wen Liqing and Wen Linhan's child. However, Wen Liqing had told her that although she didn't know what had happened between the two of them, since she had agreed, she had to hide it for Wen Liqing. Although she didn't know why she had to hide it. Why are you here? Wen Linhan asked. I have some work in Washington. A friend's child is sick, so I came to take a look, Feng Ling said simply. Wen Linhan nodded. Me too. A friend's child had a high fever in the middle of the night and was sent to the hospital for emergency treatment. They were panicking and didn't trust the doctors here. They insisted that I come to take a look, so I came. As he spoke, Wen Linhan looked at Feng Ling with a faint smile. Speaking of your work in Washington, I just remembered that you're now the Feng Corporation's. Feng Ling curved her lips lightly. Fate is not in my control. A few years ago, I didn't expect my life to turn out like this. Let's not talk about these changes, but why are you in Washington? What she really wanted to ask was, did Wen Linhan know that little Momo was here? Recently, the Medical Research Center in Washington developed a vaccine for a new virus. I came to take a look. Feng Ling looked at Wen Linhan and recalled everything that Dr. Wen had done in the base, as well as her understanding of Wen Linhan. Although she did not know much about him, although her life experience was not that rich, she could still feel that Dr. Wen was a very gentle and peaceful man. No matter how far his relationship with Wen Liqing went, Wen Liqing should not have stopped him from meeting the child. Could it be, just as Feng Ling was deep in thought, little Momo's voice suddenly came from behind. Sister. Little Momo refused to call her auntie and always called her sister. This crisp voice caused Feng Ling's expression to falter. She turned her eyes abruptly and saw little Momo running toward her with his cute short legs. Yuzheng followed closely behind and mouthed to tell her that little Momo could not stay in the ward anymore and wanted to come out to look for her. Feng Ling turned around and subconsciously wanted to cover little Momo's face, but although the little guy's legs were short, he ran quite fast. He pounced all the way to her leg and hugged it, refusing to let go. At this moment, Wen Linhan lowered his head to look at the little radish head wrapped around Feng Ling's leg. He did not see his face clearly. This is your friend's child? He's so young. How old is he? Feng Ling's heart skipped a beat. In an instant, an answer seemed to surge into her heart. Wen Liqing had told him not to let anyone else find little Momo, and it seemed like she was avoiding Wen Linhan. Li Nanheng did not explain any of this, but from some ambiguous things, he guessed that Wen Liqing did not want Wen Linhan to find the child, but could it be that Wen Linhan did not know of the child's existence at all? Could it be that Wen Liqing had been hiding it from Wen Linhan from her pregnancy to giving birth to the child to when little Momo was 2 years old? Feng Ling picked little Momo up and pressed his little head into her arms. After confirming that Wen Linhan would not see the child's face, she turned to look at him. Yes, my friend's child. Is it also a high fever? Recently, most children's illnesses are like this, Wen Linhan said and walked over. As Wen Linhan spoke, he walked over and lowered his head to look at little Momo, who was obediently lying in Feng Ling's arms. Seeing his obedient appearance and burning red ears, he smiled faintly and reached out to touch his soft little mushroom head. Let uncle see if the fever is serious. Feng Ling was about to say no, but little Momo suddenly turned his head from her arms and turned his face to Wen Linhan. Chapter 1351. Little Momo's face was facing Wen Linhan. His black, grape-like eyes carefully sized up the gentle-looking uncle standing beside Feng Ling. Then he blinked and timidly buried his face in Feng Ling's arms, hugging Feng Ling tightly with his short, white arms. From the moment the child turned his head and buried his face again, the gentle expression in Wen Linhan's eyes changed from hesitation to clarity. He abruptly raised his eyes to look at Feng Ling, who was also hugging the child tightly. Dr. Wen, I'm sorry. This child is still having a fever. I'll send him back to the ward to rest first. If we have a chance to meet again, we'll contact each other again. With that, Feng Ling turned to leave with the child in her arms. Wen Linhan did not chase after her. He just stood there and looked at Feng Ling's back. He then looked at the arms and legs of the child in her arms, and his clear eyes gradually deepened. Yu Zheng. Feng Ling quickly walked up to Yu Zheng. In order to calm Wen Linhan's doubts, she could not leave immediately. She could only send the child to Yu Zheng's arms. Send Momo back to the ward. I want to talk to that gentleman. All right, Miss Feng. Yu Zheng raised his hand and took the child, but Feng Ling covered little Momo's face with her hand, but she could not do it too deliberately. After Yu Zheng left with the child, Feng Ling pondered for a moment and turned around. She saw that Wen Linhan was standing in place, looking deeply at Yu Zheng who had taken the child away. Feng Ling walked back. Dr. Wen, if it's convenient, let's go outside and sit. Wen Linhan looked down at her. There was clearly something in his eyes, but he was never someone who would show his emotions on the surface. Hearing Feng Ling's words, his gaze fell on her face. The child looks very familiar. Feng Ling did not avoid his words, nor did she answer directly. She only pointed in the direction of the hospital door with her eyes. Wen Linhan did not say anything more. He turned and walked out. Outside the hospital, Feng Ling was blown by the cold wind. She felt a little more clear-headed about the whole thing. What's wrong with the child? Wen Linhan didn't waste any time. He stood beside her expressionlessly and looked straight into her eyes, not giving her any chance to lie. Feng Ling was silent for a moment before asking, "What did you see? Is there still a need to look?" A face says everything. Wen Linhan's eyes were cold. I'm afraid there is no second face in this world that looks so much like me and her. Especially since I grew up with her, I know very well what she looked like when she was a child and what I looked like when I was a child. To be honest, I don't know what happened, but now the child is entrusted to me. Firstly, I can't answer your questions, and secondly, I can't give the child to you. I can't contact Wen Liqing now. You should know my character. The mission I received is to fight to the death. It's the same for this child. Since she asked me to protect her and not let anyone take her away, now even if you put a knife on my neck, I can't give her to you. Wen Linhan stared at her. I know you're not a liar. Feng Ling smiled lightly. Indeed, it's difficult for me to hide anything, but I really don't know what happened. What do you know? Feng Ling turned to look at him. I met this child by chance some time ago. At that time, Xiaoqing didn't show up in front of me and left the child with me in a panic. Before she left, she sent me a message asking me to take care of the child. I'm indebted to her, so I'll definitely do my best to take good care of this child. As for the rest, I don't know what happened to her and why she hid everywhere and left the child with me. Wen Linhan's cold brows slowly furrowed. She was very flustered and needed to hide everywhere. I can tell from her text message that it's probably like this, but I'm not entirely sure, Fong Ling said and looked up at Wen Linhan. Fong Ling said and looked up at Wen Linhan. From his expression, it seemed that he didn't know what had happened to Wen Liqing in the past 2 years. How long has it been since you contacted her? Don't you know what happened to her? Fong Ling asked. Wen Linhan put one hand in his trouser pocket and sneered self-deprecatingly. If I knew, how could I have come to this point? Fong Ling was even more surprised at this moment. So what exactly happened between them? Wasn't it always Wen Liqing who chased after Wen Linhan? She had chased after him for so many years. Even though Wen Linhan had always avoided her enthusiasm, Wen Liqing's heart had always been with him. What was going on now? Fong Ling had always been slow in matters of the heart. At this moment, she didn't understand and didn't dare to guess. She just looked at Wen Linhan. She's married. Wen Linhan looked deeply at the cars driving by in the distance in the early morning. 2.5 years ago, she broke off all ties with me and left freely. She kept saying that she wanted to live a new life from now on and completely get rid of all the emotional shadows I brought to her. 2.5 years. Fong Ling paused. At that time, Wen Liqing should have been pregnant for a few months. She didn't say it out loud, but Wen Linhan must have known the situation at that time. Wen Liqing was pregnant with his child and kept saying that she wanted to get rid of him. Did something happen to the Wen family or her? Fong Ling asked cautiously. Wen Linhan didn't answer but stood there silently. No one knew what he was thinking. She looked at this man who was filled with a deep coldness and then thought of how Wen Liqing had no choice but to temporarily hand the child over to her. If there was still someone in the Wen family who Wen Liqing could entrust her to, why would he hand the child over to her? From this, it could be seen that something must have happened to the Wen family. But it seemed like Wen Linhan didn't want to say this. He wasn't good at telling others about his matters, and so was Fong Ling. The two of them stood in front of the hospital in silence for a long time. When the sun rose in the east and the coldness of the early morning subsided slightly, the phone in Fong Ling's pocket vibrated. She took it out and saw that it was a message from Yu Zheng. He said that little Momo's forehead was sweating. He had just called the doctor over to take a look and his fever had successfully subsided. Fong Ling heaved a sigh of relief and put her phone back into her pocket. Wen Linhan, who didn't see the contents of her phone, asked, "The child's fever has subsided? I want to chat with more like-minded people about, young Master M.O. Have you kissed enough, talk about life, and find a confidant W. 4M. Chapter 1352. Fong Ling turned to look at him. After all, he was a doctor. He should be very familiar with the child's high fever. He also knew when the fever would subside. She nodded. Yes, the fever has gone down. Let me take a look at the test results. Wen Linhan was not in a hurry to ask to see little Momo. Instead, he handed his hand to Fong Ling. Fong Ling looked at him and did not give it to him. "I'm a doctor," he said calmly. "After the child's fever subsides, you have to bring him to the consultation room and ask the doctor to take another look. I'll take a look at the test results. I didn't ask you to hand the child over to me immediately. Is there a problem?" He was too calm, so calm that Fong Ling felt that he must have found out everything that Wen Liqing had hidden from her over the years in these short 2 hours. However, he did not show it on his face. At this moment, he only wanted to look at the test results. She took out the test results from her pocket and handed them to him. Wen Linhan took it, looked at the medication, and all the test results, and said, "Did the doctor prescribe antivirus medicine for him?" "Yes, I'll take him to breakfast later. I think it's oral liquid." "All right." Wen Linhan looked at the name on the test results. Wen Shimo, 2 years old. 2 years old. That absurd night 3 years ago was clearly engraved in his mind. Wen Linhan looked at the test results silently. He did not look at Feng Ling but only stared at the things in his hand. It's a cold. Normal medicine. These test results are useless. Can I take them away? Yes. This thing didn't have much use. Since Wen Linhan already knew the truth, he didn't mind him taking them away. After all, little Momo's name, age, and some blood tests were written on it. There was nothing else that couldn't be taken away. Seeing that she answered so readily, Wen Linhan carefully folded the test results and held them in his hand. He glanced at her again. I'll go in to see the child. No. This time, she answered readily. Wen Linhan frowned coldly. You know very well the relationship between this child and me. I even concealed his birth and his existence for 2 years. Now that I know it, can't I even take a good look at him? Dr. Wen, based on my understanding of you, I believe you are a very good person, but I have never understood the relationship between you and Wen Liqing. Feng Ling said softly, if she hadn't entrusted the child to me, I wouldn't have meddled in other people's business. But now that she has handed the child to me, I have to do what I promised her. You can't take this child away, nor can you see him. I can't see my son. Wen Linhan's eyes turned cold. Feng Ling, what would I do to my own son to make you worried? Not really, Feng Ling said calmly. But Wen Liqing chose to hand the child to me when she had no choice but to hand him over to you. This means that the whole thing is not as simple as I thought. She naturally has her reasons for not letting you see the child. Furthermore, Momo is very obedient to his mother. If I ask him to follow me, he will obediently follow me. Now that you suddenly appeared, even if you say you are his father in front of him, I'm afraid he won't leave with you. Wen Linhan did not speak for a while and just looked at her. Feng Ling did not budge an inch. Just now, he called you sister? Wen Linhan suddenly asked softly. Yes, I've taught him many times to call me auntie, but he likes to call me sister. Little Momo's mouth is very sweet and he's very good at coaxing adults. He's especially cute and sensible. Usually, when I ask him to obediently follow auntie, he will obediently follow. He won't run around or eat anything. When he's sick, he will only hug me and cry when he's in pain. When he's sick, he won't keep crying. He's very obedient and a very likable child. Wen Linhan smiled. All right. Dr. Wen. This time, he caught a cold because the virus is too contagious. He became like this after going to the amusement park once. In the future, I will pay attention to prevent him from going to places with too many people during the flu season. In short, don't worry. He's very safe with me. If you want to bring the child to your side, the first thing you have to do is to find the child's mother. When she left America, it was no different from running for her life. I've already guessed the reason. Wen Linhan said indifferently and looked at Feng Ling seriously. I know very well what to do. Take good care of him. I can't thank you enough. Feng Ling smiled and shook her head. Miss Wen saved my life before. You also saved my life when you were at the base. There's no such thing as gratitude. The child is very adorable. Anyway, I won't mistreat him. When Feng Ling returned to the ward, little Momo had just been fed breakfast by Yu Zheng. Although he had only eaten some light porridge, the child's complexion looked much better after his fever subsided. She walked over to sit by the bed, raised her hand, and gently pinched little Momo's face. Then she smiled and teased him for a while. The child was in a good state. He smiled and pounced into her arms. Feng Ling recalled Dr. Wen's gaze and then looked at the adorable little guy in her arms. She leaned close to his ear and whispered, Momo, do you want daddy? Little Momo played with the buttons on her clothes with his fingers in her arms, but as he played with them, he shook his head vigorously. Seeing his determined shake of his head, Feng Ling was puzzled. Why? Daddy hit Mommy. When little Momo said this, he raised his little hand to tug at Feng Ling's collar. I don't want Daddy. Mommy's head is bleeding. Daddy hit me. Feng Ling's expression instantly froze. She abruptly turned to look at Yu Zheng, who was also stunned. This. Yu Zheng was in disbelief. Does this mean that little Momo's mother has lived in domestic violence for a long time? Feng Ling didn't say anything. She lowered her head and asked little Momo a few more questions, but the child refused to answer more about the role of his father. She didn't ask any more questions and called Qin Shuk to ask her to send someone to investigate the Wen family in Los Angeles in recent years. After noon, little Momo had been sent back to the hotel. After taking his medicine, he had already fallen asleep. Feng Ling saw the caller ID on her phone and walked out with her phone. From this call, she learned that 3 years ago, something happened to the Wen family and the family was destroyed. However, she didn't know what happened. After that, Wen Liqing suddenly married a wealthy Chinese businessman in Los Angeles. That wealthy businessman was in the jewelry business. The man Wen Liqing married was more than 10 years older than her. He used to be a very good-tempered person, but later, he became addicted to drugs and had a bad temper. He was even exposed by the media for beating and scolding his wife in his company's jewelry store. However, the media news was quickly suppressed. I want to chat with more like-minded people about, young Master Mo, have you kissed enough, talk about life, and find a confidant W. 4M. Chapter 1353. If these things had not been investigated in depth, it would not have been easily discovered. That was because the Chinese tycoon's reputation in Los Angeles was not low at the time. They were able to suppress all the news in the media. It was obvious that they were indeed capable. However, if he specially investigated further, all the old things that had been hidden could not be hidden. But who would specially investigate the story of a down-and-out girl? Who would care about the story of a down-and-out girl who was often subjected to domestic violence? Since Wen Liqing had said that she had severed all ties with Dr. Wen and refused to tell him what had happened for so many years, with Dr. Wen's temper, he would definitely not pester her or investigate anything. Right now, he would definitely be able to find out what she could find out. It was hard to imagine that Wen Liqing, who was so beautiful back then, had lived like this in the past few years. It was even harder to imagine what Wen Linhan would do if he found out about all this. After Feng Ling learned about everything, she stood in the living room of the hotel room for a long time. When she returned to the bedroom, she saw that little Momo was sleeping soundly. She couldn't help but recall that little Momo said he didn't want a father because his father would beat his mother. He even said that his mother's head was bleeding. Such a young child had seen all of this with his own eyes. Was that Chinese businessman a lunatic? Hitting his mother in front of a child? Wen Liqing was supposed to be a very rational person. Except for her feelings for Wen Linhan, she had always been very rational in everything she did. She was a person who had received such a good education. Furthermore, Momo was Wen Linhan's child and had nothing to do with that man. What happened to her back then? Why did she choose such a path? After little Momo woke up, Feng Ling accompanied him for dinner. After confirming that the child was fine, she rushed back to the company overnight. In 2 days, she would return to New York. When she returned, she would bring little Momo back with her. There were still many things to be busy with. She had stayed up all night in the hospital yesterday, and she still had things to do tonight, so she couldn't sleep. Qin Shuk could no longer hold it in. She closed her eyes on the sofa in the office for a while. Feng Ling supported her forehead with one hand and sat behind the desk to read the documents. She had almost sorted out the matters regarding Tming, but there was still some work to be done. When the sky was about to brighten, Feng Ling could not hold on any longer after almost 48 hours of not resting. She leaned on the table and closed her eyes for a while. Half an hour later, she suddenly woke up and continued working. After being busy for 2 days, he finally managed to negotiate a deal worth $100 million with all his sincerity before he left. After coming to Washington for the past few days, although he did not get $1 billion in financing, he had a project worth $300 to $400 million in all aspects. This trip was not in vain. The key was the successful recovery of Tming, which could be regarded as an additional few $100 million in liquidity. This urgent situation was temporarily resolved. On the way back to New York, little Momo sat in Fong Ling's car. She held the child in her arms and closed her eyes to sleep for a while. Suddenly, her phone rang. She closed her eyes and pressed the phone to her ear. She listened for a while. It was the company's higher-ups. They had many important things to discuss about Tming. She spoke a few words in a half-awake state before putting down the phone. The car continued to drive, but she could not sleep. Little Momo slept soundly. Fong Ling lowered her head to look at the lit phone screen. She opened the recent call records and found Li Nanheng's private number. Even though she had not been able to contact him in the past few days, and the few times she had called, no one answered or there was no signal, she would still call him every day when she was free. After all, she still had something to ask him about Tming. This time, the other party's phone was turned off. She called 3 times in a row, but his phone was turned off. Fong Ling lowered her head to look at the call that had been automatically cut off because the other party had turned off his phone. She watched as the phone screen turned from bright to dark. Qin Shuk sat in the front passenger seat and slept for a while. Hearing the commotion behind her, she narrowed her eyes and looked back at her. Seeing that Fong Ling was staring at her phone in a daze, she couldn't help rubbing her swollen forehead and saying, "Haven't contacted Li Nanheng yet?" Fong Ling did not answer. These past few days, everyone had been working hard and didn't have much time to chat. She only took the time to make a few calls occasionally. She couldn't get anything from Yu Zheng, and she couldn't contact Xiao Su. Li Nanheng seemed to have suddenly disappeared. Based on her years of instinct, the disappearance of a person like Li Nanheng was definitely not simple. Something must have happened. However, another voice told her that no news was the best news. After all, he had left the base a long time ago, just like her. His arm injury last time might have been an accident, and it was impossible for anything else to find him. Perhaps, he had just been too busy in the company recently. After all, she had been so busy for days and nights that she didn't touch the phone and only sat in the office reading documents. At that time, many people thought she had gone missing, but in the end, they found her in the pile of documents in the office. New York. After all, Dr. Wen already knew of little Momo's existence. Right now, there was no need to hide or avoid anyone. In order to ensure little Momo's safety, Fong Ling sent the child to the Fong family's villa and asked the 2 elders of the Fong family, who longed for a child to accompany them, to take care of him. On the other hand, she returned to the company to continue her work. On the second day after returning to New York, a local financial company in New York suddenly sent someone to discuss a $1 billion financing contract with her. When Qin Shuk heard the news, she jumped up and shouted that the heavens had eyes. She actually had 1 billion yuan of financing when she needed it the most. While Fong Ling was discussing the contract with someone, she was thinking about the recent events and this billion yuan financing contract. Why was everything so agreeable to her? If this matter had something to do with Li Nanheng, he hadn't shown up recently, but it was true that after that night in the resort, everything seemed to develop naturally. It was impossible to say that it had nothing to do with him, but if it had something to do with him, what did it mean that he hadn't appeared these days? In the conference room, Fong Ling was discussing the project with the investor. Halfway through the meeting, there was a commotion outside. The door of the conference room was suddenly knocked open. Tam and Lin Qing rushed in with guns in their hands. A few security guards who had been beaten black and blue followed in, shouting, "CEO Fong, these 2 people rushed into the company to see you. We saw that they didn't seem to have good intentions and went forward to stop them." In the end, these two people suddenly panicked and rushed in with guns. The moment Feng Ling saw that it was Tam and Lin Cheng, her gaze froze. Before she could speak, Tam suddenly said with red eyes, "Something happened to Boss Lee and Kay. We don't know if they're dead or alive. We've been looking for them for days and nights." A string in Feng Ling's mind suddenly snapped. She abruptly stood up from behind the conference table. "I want to chat with more like-minded people about, young Master Mo. Have you kissed enough? Talk about life, and find a confidant W. For M, you're tuning into the Romantic Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.